Section 1. Stark Raving Dad, the Michael Jackson episode. There is an episode of The Simpsons that aired once, on the 19th of September, 1991, was watched by millions of people across the country, was celebrated and quoted and rewatched in syndication for nearly 30 years, and then, on March 7th, 2019, was quietly removed from every streaming platform, every syndication package, every official broadcast schedule worldwide. The episode didn't explode off the air. It didn't generate a headline the night it disappeared. It simply stopped being available in the places where most people find things, and the absence was only noticed by the people who went looking. The episode is called Stark Raving Dad. It is the first episode of Season 3, and before everything that happened to it happened, it was considered one of the greatest half hours of television the show ever produced. To tell the story of why it was made and why it was taken away, you have to go back to the spring of 1991, because the context matters more than almost anything else here. The Simpsons was still a relatively young show at that point, 2 seasons in, finding the full range of what it could do, still working out the balance between the domestic realism that made it emotionally true and the outright absurdism that made it funny in ways no other animated show had been funny before. The writers were in the phase that every good creative team goes through, the phase where you know what you're capable of and you're spending your time trying to figure out how to get there. Someone in that room came up with the premise of Homer being committed to a mental institution after a workplace incident, and meeting, inside that institution, a large white man who sincerely believed he was Michael Jackson. The idea was good immediately, and it was good for reasons that went beyond the obvious joke. Michael Jackson in 1991 was something beyond famous. Dangerous, his new album, was about to come out and was already generating enormous anticipation. The Bad Tour had been one of the highest-grossing concert tours in history. Jackson existed at a level of celebrity that was genuinely unusual, even for the entertainment industry, at its most overinflated. The kind of fame where the person becomes more of a cultural symbol than a human being, where the public figure has so thoroughly absorbed the private person that the question of who Michael Jackson actually was had become genuinely difficult to answer. The writers understood that. The joke in the episode was never simply that someone claimed to be Michael Jackson. The joke was that the claim, in the context of what Michael Jackson had become, was not entirely absurd. If identity is partly performance, if celebrity is partly a shared fiction that enough people agree to maintain, then the distinction between Leon Kompowski, the large bricklayer from New Jersey, who speaks in Jackson's voice and believes himself to be the most famous man alive, and the actual Michael Jackson starts to blur in ways that the episode finds genuinely interesting rather than merely funny. But the detail that elevated the episode from a clever conceit into something genuinely memorable is the detail that the man's voice was provided by Michael Jackson himself. Jackson agreed to do it. He was a fan of the show. This has been confirmed by multiple people involved in the production, and he wanted to participate. He did it under a pseudonym. The credits listed John J. Smith as the voice of the character, a fiction so thin it barely functioned as one, because within weeks of the episode airing, it was universally known that the voice belonged to Jackson. Nobody was actually deceived. The John J. Smith credit was more of a shared understanding than a genuine disguise, a formal wink that both sides agreed to maintain while understanding that everyone knew better. Why did Jackson choose this particular role? He could have appeared as himself, the way dozens of other celebrities appeared as themselves in Simpsons episodes throughout the show's history. Instead, he chose to play a man who insisted he was Michael Jackson but wasn't. A man whose entire character is built around inhabiting an identity that belongs to someone else because that identity makes him feel good. Because when he walks into a room as Michael Jackson, people smile at him, and he had lived enough of his life in rooms where people didn't smile at him to find that experience worth maintaining. You can spend a long time looking at the layers of that if you want. The show never tells you how to look at them. It gives you the premise and leaves the looking to you. The plot itself is clean and moves well. Homer, who has violated the power plant's dress code by wearing a white shirt rather than the required blue one, is reported to the plant's psychiatric evaluation unit and committed to a mental institution. This is entirely Homer's fault, and the show doesn't try to make it seem otherwise, which is one of the things the early seasons were very good at. Homer does a thing, the consequence of the thing follows, And the comedy emerges from watching Homer navigate the consequence rather than from pretending the consequence was unfair. Inside the institution, Homer is assigned a room with Leon. Leon is warm and calm and generous with his time, and Homer, who processes the world in very direct and literal terms, accepts at face value the claim that he is sharing a room with the most famous pop star on Earth. He calls home with great excitement to announce this to his family. Bart, hearing this, immediately believes it completely. Lisa is skeptical. Marge is worried. Maggie has the pacifier. The reactions are perfectly calibrated, and the scene of Homer on the phone is one of the most economical pieces of character comedy in the season. But the episode is not actually about whether Leon is Michael Jackson. That question is set aside almost immediately, because the show understands that the question is less interesting than the story it needs to tell. The story it needs to tell is about Bart and Lisa, and specifically about something Bart has done to Lisa that he has been carrying around without fully acknowledging. He forgot her birthday, not by a small margin. Completely. Lisa's birthday came and went, and Bart was absorbed in his own concerns, and the day passed without acknowledgement. And Lisa processed this the way Lisa processes most hurts quietly, inward, without making a scene, because she has learned that making scenes in this household doesn't change anything and usually makes things worse. She stored the hurt away somewhere and kept going. Leon, listening to Homer's phone calls home and piecing together the Simpson family dynamics from what Homer let slip, gently brings this to Bart's attention. He doesn't lecture. He doesn't moralize. He just points at the thing that's there and asks Bart if he sees it. And Bart, who is 10 years old and not always great at seeing things that require him to look outward rather than inward, does see it, in this instance, and wants to do something about it. Leon helps him write a song. It is called Lisa, It's Your Birthday, and it is gentle and slightly clumsy in the specific way that things made by people trying harder than they know how are always slightly clumsy, and it is performed in Michael Jackson's voice to a delighted 8-year-old in a Simpson family living room, and it works. It works in the simple, direct way that genuine gestures work, when they don't ask for anything in return and don't perform the giving for an audience but just give. The scene is soft and unhurried, and it trusts the audience to feel what it's showing them without being told to feel it. The early seasons of The Simpsons were very good at this. They understood that the most reliable way to earn an emotional response is to be honest about the emotion and then step back and let the scene breathe, rather than cueing the audience with swelling music and meaningful close-ups. When Homer is released and brings Leon home briefly, the episode extends the warmth of the birthday sequence into a family scene that earns everything it asks for. And then, at the very end, Leon tells the truth. He is a bricklayer from New Jersey. His name is Leon Kompowski. He adopted the persona because it made people smile at him. He found an identity that generated warmth from the world, and he decided to live inside it because the alternative was living outside it, and the outside was colder. The final shot is Leon walking away down the street, happy and ordinary and completely himself, and the episode closes without underlining the feeling it has generated because it trusts the feeling to carry itself. The episode was celebrated immediately. It received a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Animated Program. For 27 years, it was a reliable presence in syndication, cited consistently in discussions of the show's early greatness, an episode that fans of a certain age watched so many times that specific lines from it are still retrievable without effort. Then, Leaving Neverland aired. The documentary, directed by Dan Reed and released in early 2019, is 4 hours of detailed testimony from two men, Wade Robson and James Safechuck, about the sexual abuse they say they experienced at Michael Jackson's hands when they were children. The film does not make comfortable viewing. It is specific and sustained, and the testimony is delivered with a completeness of detail that is, whatever one concludes about its truth, not easy to dismiss or to sit with comfortably. The allegations in the documentary are contested. Jackson's estate has denied them consistently and vigorously since his death in 2009, and the legal and factual arguments around the film's specific claims are ongoing and unresolved. Whether Wade Robson and James Safechuck are telling the truth is a question that has not been and may never be definitively settled in the way that legal proceedings can settle questions. But the cultural impact of the film was immediate and enormous. Radio stations pulled Jackson's music. Streaming services removed his work from algorithmically generated recommendations. Companies that had maintained any kind of formal relationship with Jackson-adjacent content reassessed those relationships very quickly. Within days of the documentary's premiere, the question of Stark raving dad was being raised in entertainment media. The episode had been made with Jackson's voice, with Jackson's enthusiastic participation, as a collaboration between Jackson and the show that had always been acknowledged at some level even while the John J. Smith fiction was maintained. The episode was tied to Jackson in a way that could not be cleanly severed by pointing at the pseudonym. The show's creative team moved relatively quickly. Matt Groening, James L. Brooks, and Al Jean released a statement saying that Stark Raving Dad would be removed from all platforms and all syndication packages. They said specifically that the decision was made out of respect for the people who came forward in the documentary, and they were careful not to position the removal as a conclusion about the truth of the allegations. They were acknowledging that continuing to make the episode easily available felt, to them, like a statement they were not comfortable making, and that the episode's deep entanglement with Jackson, as a collaborator, made its continued availability something they needed to address. The removal was executed. Disney Plus, which had become the home of the streaming Simpsons catalog after Disney acquired Fox, Hulu, all international streaming arrangements, all syndication packages. The episode disappeared from all the places where most people find things. What makes this specific ban different from almost everything else in the show's content history is that it was chosen. Nobody threatened legal action. No government issued a demand. No advertiser made a call. The people who made the episode decided, on their own, that something they were proud of needed to be removed from the accessible record because the world around it had changed in ways that made its continued presence feel wrong to them. That kind of self-imposed removal is genuinely unusual. The financial incentives run entirely the other direction. Syndicated content generates revenue. Streaming catalog generates subscription value. The people who made Stark Raving Dad absorbed a financial cost to honor a moral judgment, and they did it without being forced to, and that fact is worth acknowledging regardless of whether one agrees with the judgment itself. The episode still exists. The production masters are in the archive. Fan sites and preservation communities have kept it accessible for anyone who goes looking. The internet preserves what institutions prefer to erase, and in this case, the preservation is thorough enough that the episode is findable for anyone who wants to find it. But it won't appear in your streaming queue. It won't come up in a late-night channel surf. Season 3 has a gap at episode 1 now, and the gap is visible to anyone who knows to look for it, and invisible to anyone who doesn't. Leon Kompowski walked away down the street and didn't come back. The large man from New Jersey who liked making people smile was asked to leave the building, and the question of whether the thing that made the rooms he walked into warmer was worth the cost of what he was carrying. That question stays open, unresolved, sitting in the space where the episode used to be. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. There's a lot more of this to come. Section 2. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson. This one is different from the others. Not different in the way that every story is slightly different. Fundamentally different in its category, in its cause, in what it reveals about the relationship between popular culture and the world it is trying to describe. This isn't a story about a corporation making a legal calculation. It isn't a story about a government protecting its reputation or a network protecting its advertiser relationships. It is a story about grief, about what happens when a catastrophe reaches backward through time and changes the meaning of things that existed before it. About how collective trauma rewrites context so completely that certain images become, for a period, genuinely unwatchable, not because they are harmful, but because they are too close to a wound that is still entirely open. The episode is The City of New York versus Homer Simpson. It is the first episode of Season 9, which means it aired in the fall of 1997. The director was Jim Reardon. The writer was Ian Maxtone Graham. It was received well, reviewed positively, and settled into the syndication rotation as a reliable episode with several strong comic sequences and a genuine warmth toward New York City underneath its premise of Homer trying to navigate the city he has irrationally avoided for years. The premise is one of the show's best from that period. Barney Gumble is assigned as the designated driver for a night at Moe's, and Barney, whose relationship to sobriety is always fragile, and who faces the specific challenge of being in a bar all night, fails at this assignment completely and catastrophically. Homer's car ends up in his custody. The car ends up towed. The car ends up wedged, somehow, in a parking space in Lower Manhattan, in the narrow gap between the two towers of the World Trade Center. Homer has to go get it. This setup is perfect for what the show was good at in Season 9, because Homer's aversion to New York City is not simply a preference. It is a phobia, specific and intense and rooted in a previous visit that went comprehensively wrong in ways the episode depicts in a flashback with the particular fondness the show had for finding comedy in remembered suffering. Homer's fear of the city is real within the show's established parameters, which means the episode has genuine comic stakes. He is not visiting a place he mildly dislikes. He is being forced by bureaucratic necessity to go somewhere that genuinely frightens him. What happens in New York divides along the lines of the Simpson family's established characters, with the precision the show was extremely good at during these seasons. Marge and the children take to the city with delight. Lisa wants to see a Broadway show and finds one and is enchanted by it. Bart wants to be in the city alone and gets to explore it with the specific freedom that makes 11-year-old boys love cities in a way that their parents usually spend most of the trip trying to manage. The city opens for all of them as a real place, vivid and interesting and full of things they couldn't have found anywhere else. Homer sits in a parking booth waiting for a meter enforcement officer who seems to be on a schedule designed to ensure he will be there as long as possible before any resolution is available. The humor of Homer's sections is physical and internal. The comedy of a man whose anxiety about being somewhere is so consuming that he cannot see anything about the place except the ways in which it is failing to provide immediate relief. The episode has real affection for New York. That is worth saying clearly, because it matters to the story of what happened to the episode after September 2001. The show is not depicting New York as a nightmare. It is depicting Homer's experience of New York as something close to a nightmare, but the gap between Homer's experience and the city's actual reality is the joke. Marge and the kids are having the time of their lives. The city is magnificent and alive and full of the specific energy that makes it one of the most remarkable places on Earth. Homer is just too wrapped in his own misery to see any of it. The Twin Towers are in the episode throughout. They appear in establishing shots, they frame scenes. They are the physical anchor of the episode's central premise, the specific place where Homer's car is parked, the specific place he is trying to get back to every time he leaves the parking booth and has to navigate back through the city. They are enormous and present and part of the episode's visual vocabulary in a way that cannot be removed without removing the episode itself. The episode aired the 21st of September 1997, 4 years and almost exactly to the day before the 11th of September 2001. On the 11th of September 2001, 2 commercial aircraft were deliberately flown into the World Trade Center. Both towers collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people died. It was the deadliest terrorist attack in American history and one of the most significant single days in the history of the country, an event that restructured the national consciousness in ways that are still being worked through more than 2 decades later. The episode was pulled from syndication immediately, not through any formal mechanism, not through an official directive or a regulatory decision. Local stations and national syndication networks simply looked at the episode and made the decision that did not require articulation. This could not air. Not now. Not while the wound was this fresh. Not while the country was still in the immediate aftermath of watching those buildings come down on live television, while the grief was still raw and total, and the enormity of the loss was still something that people were struggling to hold in their minds. The decision happened across the broadcasting infrastructure without anyone issuing the instruction, because the decision was so obvious that it didn't require instruction. 1,000 different programmers and schedulers, looking at their lineups, made the same judgment independently and arrived at the same outcome. This episode does not go on the air. This is worth pausing on, because the distributed nature of this particular act of removal tells you something specific about how collective grief operates in relation to media. The Stark Raving Dad removal was one institution making one decision. The City of New York removal was thousands of individuals making the same decision simultaneously because the shared experience of the event had made the decision obvious enough to be arrived at without consultation. The episode was not the only content that disappeared from American television in that period. Any film or television show with prominent World Trade Center imagery was reconsidered. Any plotline involving aircraft disasters or mass casualty events was reviewed. The entertainment industry was in a state of comprehensive reassessment about what it was appropriate to put on television in the weeks and months following the attacks, and those reassessments happened quickly and were applied broadly. The Simpsons episode sat in a particular category. It did not simply feature the towers and background shots the way many New York set productions did. It made the towers the architectural center of its premise. The joke about Homer's car being parked between them required their presence and their scale. The entire structure of the episode's central plot depended on those specific buildings in that specific location being the place Homer needed to get to. You cannot watch that episode in the weeks after September 2001 without watching it through the filter of what you know has happened to those buildings, and what you know has happened makes the comedy impossible. Not because the comedy is wrong, not because the episode is disrespectful, but because the specific pleasure the episode finds in the tower's physical presence, the way the joke depends on their immensity, their solidity, their absolute domination of the lower Manhattan skyline, is inseparable from the grief that their absence generated. The episode makes you feel the towers as real and enormous and present, and in September 2001, feeling them as real and enormous and present meant feeling their loss. The episode stayed out of syndication for a significant period. In some markets, particularly American ones where the grief was most direct, the episode did not return to regular rotation for years. International markets handled it differently depending on their own relationship to the event and to American grief, and in some places the episode returned more quickly. The episode eventually came back. It is on Disney Plus now. It is in the official Season 9 catalog. The passage of time has done what time does with all grief, not healed it exactly, but created enough distance from the immediate rawness that the episode can be watched again as what it was made to be. A comedy about Homer's parking ticket. A love letter to New York wrapped in the frame of Homer's inability to appreciate what he is being given access to. The towers exist in the episode now, the way they exist in photographs from that era of New York's history, present and massive, and themselves, carrying a weight they were not carrying when the images were made, seen now through the lens of everything that came after. You can still find the episode funny. You can still appreciate what the show did with the city and with Homer's specific relationship to it. But you watch it differently. The knowledge is always there. The years when the episode was absent are part of its biography now. A chapter nobody chose to write but that the event of September 11th wrote on behalf of everyone. Sometimes the world does that to the things you've made. Sometimes the world changes so completely around something you created that the thing you created is changed too, not in its content but in its context, and the context turns out to matter more than you thought it would when you were making it. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson was made as a comedy. It was received as a comedy. For 4 years it lived as a comedy in the syndication rotation and in the memories of the people who watched it. Then the context changed, and the comedy held still while everything around it shifted, and the stillness of the comedy in the middle of the shifted context was what made it, for a while, impossible to look at. Homer eventually got his car back. Within the logic of the episode's story, the meter enforcement officer never came. Homer improvised a solution. The family drove away from New York, and the episode ended with Homer at the wheel and the city receding behind them and the show finding the right note to close on, which is usually somewhere between funny and fond. The towers were still there when the episode ended. They were still there on the day the episode aired. For 4 years, every time the episode ran in syndication, the towers were still there, permanent and enormous in the lower Manhattan skyline, doing what they had always done, which was to make the city look like itself. And then they weren't. Section 3. Blame it on Lisa. The Brazil incident. The year is 2002. The Simpsons is 13 seasons in. The show has developed a reliable template for its international travel episodes, having discovered that sending the Simpson family outside the United States reliably generates comedy from the specific kind of American self-absorption that is easier to see when it is placed in contrast with a different cultural context. Australia worked. Japan was excellent. England and France gave the writers material for jokes that played well to the show's broad American audience. Now the family is going to Brazil. The episode is called Blame It on Lisa, and it aired on the 31st of March 2002. The premise is genuinely clean and gives the episode the kind of specific structure it needs to function. Lisa has been secretly sponsoring a Brazilian orphan named Ronaldo through one of those charitable sponsorship programs. And when the monthly checks stop being cashed, she becomes worried and convinces the family to go to Brazil to investigate. The investigation takes them to Rio de Janeiro, and Rio gives the writers approximately 10 minutes of material organized around jokes about Brazilian culture, Brazilian urban life, Brazilian wildlife, and the particular chaos the show imagined as characteristic of a large South American city. Within days of the episode airing, the Brazilian government's tourism ministry released an official statement condemning it. Embratur, the country's tourism board, announced that it was studying legal action against Fox Broadcasting Company. The culture minister made his own public statement. Brazilian press coverage of the episode was extensive and across the range of what was written, largely furious. To understand what they were objecting to, you have to walk through what the episode actually depicted, because the objections were specific and grounded in specific content and deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms before anything else. The episode depicted Rio de Janeiro as a city comprehensively and casually overrun with crime. The Simpson family is robbed multiple times within their first hours in the city, and these robberies are not presented as exceptional events or as the kind of bad luck that could happen anywhere. They are presented as the ambient texture of daily life in Rio, as simply what happens in this city on a continuous basis. The thieves are relaxed about it. The local population treats it as routine. The frame of the episode communicates, through accumulated incident rather than any single explicit claim, that in this city being robbed is not an unusual occurrence that visitors should be wary of. It is just what happens, constantly, to everyone, as a feature of being in the place at all. The episode also depicted Brazilian wildlife as uniformly and enthusiastically dangerous. Rats of unusual size appear in places you would not want to encounter them. Snakes materialize in contexts that make them threatening rather than simply present. Monkeys are aggressive and apparently ubiquitous in the urban environment. The wildlife of Brazil, as the episode presents it, is not the wildlife of one of the most ecologically extraordinary countries on Earth. It is the wildlife of a place that seems designed specifically to make visitors uncomfortable and to validate whatever anxieties they arrived with. Then there is the sequence in which Homer is kidnapped. He is grabbed off the street by local men who hold him for ransom. This is played for comedy. The kidnappers are not terrifying figures, and Homer's response to his own kidnapping is characteristically oblivious and unhelpful, but the image is clear and specific. A tourist in Rio is grabbed off a street by local residents who want money for his return. That is something that happens in this city, the episode says. That is a thing you should factor into your thinking about visiting. Finally, there is a joke about a Brazilian television channel that seems to broadcast programming featuring nude men engaging in various activities. This is offered as another casual fact of Brazilian cultural life. The kind of observation you make about a place when you want to signal its foreignness to an American audience by marking it as transgressive in ways that American culture has decided it is not. The Brazilian government's position was specific. The episode was not simply exaggerated for comic effect. It was organized around a particular vision of Brazil that drew from a long history of American representations of South American countries as dangerous, chaotic, and barely civilized. And that vision had real effects on how people who watched it would think about Brazil and would make decisions about whether to engage with it as a destination or a trading partner or a country worth taking seriously on its own terms. Fox's position was also specific. It was satire. The show exaggerated for effect in every episode it produced. The Australia episode had made Australians seem obsessed with toilets and boots. The Japan episode had depicted Japanese culture through caricature. The mechanism was consistent, and the Brazil episode was not doing anything different from what the show had always done. Both positions contained genuine truth, and both positions missed something important about the other. Fox was right that the mechanism was consistent. The Simpsons has always exaggerated for effect. That is the engine of its comedy. Taking the episode out of that context and treating it as a straightforward documentary claim about Brazilian urban life does miss something real about what satire does and how it works. But the Brazilian objectors were pointing at something the Fox defense glossed over: which is the asymmetry in how caricature lands depending on who is being caricatured and in what relationship to the person doing the caricaturing. When The Simpsons depicted Australia as a country obsessed with toilets and boots, it was an American show making jokes about an English-speaking developed country with substantial cultural visibility in the global media landscape. Australians had, and have, the cultural infrastructure to respond to that caricature on their own terms, to be seen responding to it, and to be understood by the global audience as representing a real country with a real voice that could speak for itself if it chose to. The caricature happened between roughly comparable cultural parties. It was a joke across a relatively even cultural terrain. The caricature of Brazil operated in a different relationship. Brazil is not an English-speaking country. Its media industry, while significant within Latin America and increasingly globally, did not have in 2002 the same kind of international platform that English-speaking countries' media industries had. The specific stereotypes the episode drew on the dangerous South American city, the crime-ridden streets, the threatening wildlife, the culturally transgressive television were not fresh comic inventions that the show created from scratch. They were drawn from a deep, pre-existing well of American popular culture representations of Latin America that had been accumulating for decades, that were familiar to American audiences because American audiences had been absorbing those representations for their entire media-consuming lives. When the episode deployed those stereotypes, it was not just making jokes. It was confirming the stereotypes that the audience already carried, giving those stereotypes the validation of appearing in a trusted, beloved show, sending the audience back out into the world with the same ideas about Brazil they had arrived with, but now slightly more confident in those ideas because The Simpsons had told them the ideas were correct. That is the meaningful difference between the Australia episode and the Brazil episode. One was a fresh exaggeration of things that were not particularly loaded. The other was the reproduction of stereotypes that had already done significant damage to how American audiences thought about a specific part of the world. Embrater's director at the time described the episode as containing grotesque and untrue information that could cause enormous damage to the country's image abroad. His framing of it as factually incorrect information, rather than as satire that went too far, reflected the seriousness with which the board viewed the episode's potential impact. He was not saying the show was bad at satire. He was saying the satire was built on false premises that, once deployed to an audience of millions, would be very difficult to correct. The legal action that Embrater threatened was never actually filed. Fox's legal assessment was that the satirical nature of the content provided substantial protection under American law, and this assessment turned out to be correct in the sense that no lawsuit materialized. But the threat generated significant press coverage in both Brazil and the United States, put Fox in the position of having to publicly defend the episode, and created a diplomatic moment in which a foreign government had formally objected to an American entertainment product on the grounds that it misrepresented and harmed that government's country. In Brazil, the episode's broadcast situation was complicated in ways that varied by region and broadcaster. Some Brazilian networks that were syndicating The Simpsons at the time handled the episode with restricted promotion or limited broadcast schedules. Others aired it without modification. The Brazilian fan base for the show was real and large, and Brazilian viewers found themselves navigating the uncomfortable position of being fans of something that had treated their country with what many of them felt was a specific, pointed, unfair contempt. The episode remains in the official Simpsons catalog. It is available on streaming services. It continues to air in syndication. There was no formal ban, no permanent removal, no outcome that matches the Michael Jackson episode or the September 11th situation in terms of the episode's ongoing accessibility. What the Brazil incident produced instead was a case study in the mechanics of cultural representation that has been analyzed and discussed in media studies for more than 2 decades since. It is regularly cited in academic and journalistic discussions of how American popular culture represents non-American communities, about the power dynamics of who gets to depict whom and in what terms, about what satire is allowed to do, and who bears the cost when it does it badly. The show went back to Latin America in later episodes. The engagement with the region became somewhat more careful over time, though the direction of the show's humor did not change fundamentally. The same instinct to find comedy in the gap between American assumptions and non-American reality continued to operate with varying degrees of care about what those assumptions were built on and what their deployment might mean to the people on the other side of them. Blame It on Lisa is not the show's worst episode of that type. It is not even particularly mean-spirited in tone. The family's experience in Brazil is unpleasant but comedic, and the episode's fundamental structure. Lisa's genuine concern for a child she has been trying to help from a distance has real heart in it. The problem is not the heart of the episode. The problem is the wallpaper the episode chose to paste over the heart, the background assumption about what Brazil was that made the jokes land for an American audience the way they were intended to. The wallpaper came from somewhere. It came from 100 films and television shows that had been telling American audiences the same story about South American cities since before most of the people in that writer's room were born. The Simpsons did not invent the stereotype, but it reproduced it, gave it the legitimacy of being associated with a show that was trusted and beloved, and sent it back out into the world for another generation of American viewers to absorb. That is what Embratur was objecting to. Not a single episode of television. The accumulated weight of a story that had been told about their country too many times by too many American voices, and that this episode had now told again. Section 4. Homer's Phobia. The episode the network tried to kill. Season 8, Episode 15. The 16th of February, 1997. Written by Ron Houge. Directed by Mike Anderson. Featuring John Waters as the voice of John, a flamboyantly gay antique dealer who becomes important to the Simpson family in ways nobody anticipated. The episode won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Animated Program. Before that happened, Fox tried to prevent the episode from being made. The premise: The Simpsons discover an antique shop owned by a man named John, who is warm and funny and immediately endearing, and Homer, oblivious as Homer reliably is to anything that requires him to read a social situation, accurately befriends John with genuine delight before discovering that John is gay. Homer's response is the specific kind of homophobia that has always been the hardest to confront because it does not look like hostility from the inside. It looks like discomfort. It looks like concern. It looks like the reasonable anxiety of a man who does not hate gay people exactly, but finds their proximity unsettling in a way he cannot fully articulate and has never been required to examine. Homer's specific fear centers on Bart. He becomes convinced that John's friendship with Bart will somehow make Bart gay. This is not a rational fear, and the episode does not pretend it is rational. But it is an extremely common fear, and the show's willingness to depict it with that kind of unsparing specificity to show Homer's homophobia not as cartoonish villainy but as the ordinary, domestic, poorly examined prejudice that it usually actually is in real life, was a significant part of what made the episode feel like something the show needed to make. The Fox network disagreed, strongly and at length. The network's Standards and Practices Department raised objections to the episode through the internal review process, and those objections were specific and pointed. The concern was not that the episode depicted a gay character. The concern was that the episode depicted a gay character sympathetically, with depth, with a full inner life that was not organized around his sexual orientation as a punchline. The network was uncomfortable with the episode's framing of Homer's homophobia as the thing that needed to change, rather than John's existence as a gay man as the problem to be managed. The network was uncomfortable with the episode taking the subject seriously as a human issue rather than using it as a quick gag in an episode about something else. These objections came in the form of notes. The show's team pushed back on every substantive one. The pushback was sustained across months of the production process, with the writers defending specific choices against specific concerns and refusing to make the modifications that would have produced an episode that was acceptable to the network, but would have gutted everything that made the episode worth making. Al Jean has talked about this fight in interviews over the years. The commitment in the writer's room to making the episode as written, to not accepting a neutered version of it, was genuine and specific. The team understood what would be lost if they gave ground on the elements the network was most uncomfortable with, and they were not willing to accept those losses. They held the line. The episode was made as written. It aired on the 16th of February, 1997, and the response told the story. The Emmy nomination came, the award came, and the episode's reputation in the years since has only grown, consistently cited as one of the best things the show ever did. The John Waters character deserves specific attention because the choice to cast Waters and to write John as the character John is was central to everything the episode accomplished. Waters had built his entire career around the celebration of outsider culture, camp aesthetics, and the specific beauty of things that mainstream America had decided were too strange or too excessive or too much to take seriously. His presence in the episode is not incidental to the episode's argument. He is the argument. John is completely at ease with himself. He is not defined by Homer's discomfort with him. He has a rich and specific inner life that the episode sketches quickly, the antique shop full of kitschy Americana, the particular aesthetic he has constructed around himself, the sense of humor that is warm and self-aware and genuinely funny. He is a person who exists independently of the reactions other people have to him, which is a quality that the best guest characters in the show's history always had. They were not just celebrity appearances, they were characters. The episode's treatment of Homer's arc is careful in a way that the show's lesser episodes about important social subjects often weren't. Homer does not have a revelation. He does not deliver a speech. He does not, at the end of the episode, announce that he has learned something and is now a changed man. He does something decent for John in the episode's climax, a genuinely decent thing that requires him to set aside his discomfort and act like the kind of person he would prefer to be, and the episode lets that action be the resolution without underlining it. That restraint is what makes the episode work. It trusts the audience to see what Homer doing the decent thing means without being told what it means. It trusts Homer's character enough to let the change be small and real rather than large and declarative. The scene that precedes the climax in which Homer takes Bart to a steel mill to try to make him more masculine, and the steel mill turns out to be a gay bar, and Homer is forced to reckon with the gap between his mental image of what gay culture looks like and what he is actually seeing is both funny and honest, in the way that the best Simpsons sequences from this period were funny and honest. It finds the joke in the specific rather than the general. It is not a joke about gay people. It is a joke about Homer's specific, incorrect, anxiety-constructed picture of gay people, and the gap between that picture and the reality it can't survive contact with. Homer's phobia did not air in certain markets. In Russia, which later codified restrictions on positive depictions of same-sex relationships in broadcasting law, the episode has had a complicated broadcast history across different periods. In several Middle Eastern markets, the episode was not included in syndication packages. In other parts of the world where local broadcasters made their own content decisions about what was appropriate for their audiences, the episode was either time-shifted to later night slots or quietly omitted from the rotation. The specific list of places where Homer's phobia received restricted broadcast is not perfectly documented in any single publicly available record. The situation varied by country, by broadcaster, by period, and by the specific legal and regulatory context of each market. What is consistent across all of those variations is the underlying dynamic. In each place where the episode was restricted, the reason was the sympathetic depiction of a gay character. The same quality that made the episode excellent television, the same quality the Emmy Committee recognized as worth honoring, was the quality that made it unsuitable for certain audiences in the judgment of the people controlling those broadcasts. The episode the network tried to kill survived the network. The fights that happened in offices in Los Angeles in 1996 and 1997, the months of notes and pushback and sustained refusal to give ground, produced something that is still watched and still matters nearly 30 years later. The episodes that get banned are not usually the bad ones. They are usually the ones that were trying to say something true enough that the people who preferred the truth not be said tried to stop it. Homer's phobia got made anyway. That matters. That is worth knowing. Section 5. The Arabic Simpsons, The Art of the Invisible Edit. The Simpsons has been broadcast in more than 60 countries. The number itself is remarkable, given what the show is built around. A program organized entirely around American suburban life, the American nuclear power industry, the American two-car garage, the American convenience store, the American Protestant church, the American political corruption that is so particular in its flavor and so consistent in its operations, managed to find an audience large enough and loyal enough in dozens of countries with radically different relationships to all. of those specifics to sustain distribution deals for decades. The show crossed borders that should have stopped it and kept going. That crossing was never clean. It left traces in every market, in the form of modifications and alterations and localization decisions that produced, in different countries, different versions of the show. The Arabic version of The Simpsons is one of the most discussed examples of what happens when an American entertainment product is adapted for a substantially different cultural context. Not because the modifications were the largest the show underwent anywhere in the world, but because the modifications were specific enough and systematic enough to be tracked and documented, and to make visible the full extent of what adapting American popular culture for a Muslim-majority broadcasting context actually required. The adaptation was produced through a dubbing process that was, from the beginning, understood to require more than translation. The show was popular enough in Middle Eastern markets to justify the investment of a full localization, but the content of the show was sufficiently far from what those markets' broadcasting standards would permit that a straight translation was never a realistic option. The dubbing work had to be accompanied by script modification, and the script modifications had to address a range of content that the original show had built its entire comic architecture around. Start with Homer's beer. Homer Simpson's relationship to Duff beer is one of the show's foundational elements. It is structural to his character, to his social world, to his relationship with the other men he spends time with, to the way he copes with the frustrations of his life, and to the specific quality of his relaxation. Moe's Tavern, where Homer and his friends drink, is one of the show's most important recurring locations. The conversations that happen there, the community that forms around the bar itself, the particular social function that the bar serves for Homer and Barney and Lenny and Carl, these are not incidental to the show's depiction of American working-class male life. They are central to it. The bar is where the men of Springfield go when they are not at work and not yet home, and what they do there tells you something real about what that in-between space means in American culture. In the Arabic version, Homer's beer became a fizzy, non-alcoholic drink. The scripts were modified to remove all references to alcohol. The visual presentation of the can was not changed. The animation remained the same, but the dialogue had Homer and everyone around him discussing their affection for a carbonated, non-alcoholic beverage with the same intensity and attachment that the original scripts gave to beer. The gap between what the image shows and what the dialogue says is not small. You are watching a man who looks like he is holding a beer in a bar with his friends, being told by the audio that he is holding a soft drink. If you have watched the original show, the modification is constantly visible, a layer of substitution sitting on top of the original content that cannot be made invisible because the visual layer of the show was not changed to match the audio. The experience of watching the Arabic version of The Simpsons with knowledge of what the original contains is the experience of watching a show that is constantly referencing something it has been prevented from naming. The shapes of the original content are visible in the space where the original content has been replaced. Homer loving his soft drink with the desperation of a man who needs what the soft drink is not is the most visible of these shapes. But there are others throughout. Hot dogs became beef and lamb sandwiches. The modification was made to comply with halal dietary requirements, and it is more functionally benign than the beer substitution because the underlying meaning of a hot dog in the original show, a convenience food, an American staple, the specific low-effort pleasure of eating something familiar can be carried by the substitute without too much distortion. But the modification is still a modification, still a decision made by someone with authority over the content that the content as made was not acceptable for the audience receiving it. Religious content required more complex decisions. The Simpsons family's relationship to Christianity is not a background detail. The family attends church regularly. Reverend Lovejoy is a recurring character. God appears in the show's universe and has conversations with Homer. The show treats Christianity as the dominant cultural context of the Simpson family's life and engages with that context with a combination of genuine affection and fairly pointed satirical observation. Making this content work in an Islamic broadcasting context required choices that varied depending on the specific element being addressed. Some elements of Christian practice and theology that appeared in the show could be mapped onto Islamic equivalents without substantial loss of meaning, the family going to a place of worship, The community gathering around shared religious practice, the experience of faith as something the characters engage with imperfectly but sincerely. Other elements were more specifically rooted in the traditions of American Protestant Christianity in ways that had no clean equivalent and had to be modified or removed. The Ned Flanders character presented particular challenges throughout this process. Ned's identity is entirely built around his specific, earnest, slightly eccentric evangelical Christianity. The comedy of Ned emerges from the gap between his sincere religiosity and the chaos of the world around him, a world whose events consistently refuse to confirm the tidy moral framework his faith provides. Making Ned generically religious rather than specifically Christian in the American evangelical tradition changes who Ned is at a fundamental level, because the specificity of his faith, its particular rules, its particular vocabulary, its particular social expressions is what generates his character. A generically religious Ned is a much smaller character than the original. The comedy becomes less specific, the characterization less precise, the gap between his faith and his experience less pointed. He can still exist in the Arabic version, he is just less himself. These modifications were made in different ways by different broadcasters in different markets, because the Arabic language version of the show was not uniform across all the countries that received it. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Lebanon, the Gulf states each had its own regulatory requirements and its own cultural context, and different decisions were made in different places. Some markets modified more extensively, some modified less. The result is that the Arabic Simpsons is not a single coherent adaptation but a range of adaptations, each shaped by the specific requirements of the market it was produced for. What is consistent across all of them is the underlying fact. The show as made was not acceptable for the audience receiving it, and the solution was modification rather than non-broadcast. The show was popular enough, and the revenue from its distribution valuable enough, that the work of making it fit was considered worthwhile. The modifications were the cost of the distribution deal. This is a different category of ban from the ones we discuss elsewhere tonight, and it is worth being specific about what makes it different. A ban is a prohibition. It says, "This thing shall not be shown here." The modifications made to the Arabic version of The Simpsons are not a prohibition. They are a transformation. The show exists. It is available. It is watched and enjoyed. But the version that is available is not the show that was made. It is the show that was made after passing through a set of requirements that stripped out significant amounts of the specific cultural content, that gave the show's comedy its meaning and its edge. The question this raises is whether the resulting product is still The Simpsons in any meaningful sense. It has the character designs, it has the plots. It has the voice rhythms and the timing and the visual language that make the show recognizable. But the specific things the show was saying about American working-class life, about the relationship between men and alcohol as a social glue, about the particular textures of Protestant Christianity in the American suburbs, those things require the specific cultural vocabulary the show was built around to say them. Replace the vocabulary and you replace the meaning. And replacing the meaning is replacing the show even when the images look the same. There is also something worth sitting with about what the invisible modification does to the audience. The people watching the Arabic version of The Simpsons were watching a show that had been significantly altered without being told it had been significantly altered. The modifications were invisible to them precisely because they had no reference point for what the original contained. They were watching what looked like the complete show. The gaps, the places where the original content had been replaced with substitutes were invisible unless you already knew they were there. This is a particularly quiet form of censorship. The audience is not told that anything has been removed. They are not given the opportunity to seek out the original version and decide for themselves what they think of the difference. They simply receive the modified version as if it is the version, as if the beer was always soda and the hot dogs were always beef and lamb, and Ned's Christianity was always a generic piety rather than a specific, richly textured, comedically productive religiosity. The ban is in the invisibility. The invisibility is its mechanism. The audience cannot object to the removal of something they don't know was there. Section 6. Natural-born kissers and the question of what bodies are allowed to do. Season 9, Episode 25. The 17th of May, 1998. The season finale. Written by Larry Doyle. The premise is one of the more formally interesting setups the show produced in this period. Homer and Marge discover that the risk of getting caught in intimate situations together is more effective at maintaining the vitality of their marriage than anything else they have tried, which generates a series of escalating comic set pieces that follow their increasingly public search for the sensation of almost being caught. The logic of the premise is sound, and the show pursues it with the systematic quality it brought to its best structural premises. If the near discovery generates the feeling, then the feeling should increase as the near discoveries become more extreme. The episode builds accordingly, moving Homer and Marge through a series of outdoor spaces with decreasing privacy until they arrive, naked, in the middle of a professional football field in front of a full stadium during a game. This is where the premise wanted to end up, and the episode gets there efficiently and without cheating. The nudity at the end of the episode is the logical endpoint of everything that preceded it. The whole structure of the story points toward this final exposure, and when it arrives, it is handled in the specific way that American broadcast television in the late 1990s handled nudity, through camera angles and reaction shots, and the strong implication of what is happening, rather than the explicit depiction of it. You see Homer and Marge from behind. You see the stadium's reaction. You understand entirely and without ambiguity what is happening. But what you are shown is technically within the standards that American broadcast television applied to this category of content. In the United States, the episode aired as part of the normal Season 9 broadcast schedule. The nudity was implied, the framing was comedic, and the episode's emotional underpinning that Homer and Marge's physical relationship is something worth maintaining, that the effort to keep their marriage alive is genuinely important to both of them, was wholesome enough in its conclusion to balance the unconventional delivery. In the United Kingdom, the situation was more complicated. The UK broadcasting environment in 1998 applied different standards to family hour content than the American environment applied. The watershed, the time before which content must be suitable for children, was a more actively enforced boundary in UK broadcasting than its rough American equivalent, and the standards for what could appear before the watershed were more specific and more consistently applied. BBC Two, which was broadcasting The Simpsons in that period, handled natural-born kissers with more caution than most Season 9 episodes received. The specific form that caution took varied slightly depending on the account. Reports from UK viewers at the time described the episode being time-shifted to a later slot, being broadcast with a content advisory, and in some cases having the most extended moments of nudity-adjacent content shortened. The combination of these measures was sufficient to produce a UK broadcast of the episode that was different from the American broadcast in terms of when it aired and what it showed in the specific sequences involving Homer and Marge's outdoor encounters. These differences were minor in absolute terms. The episode was not substantially altered. The story remained intact. Most UK viewers who watched the episode probably did not notice or care about the differences between what they received and what the American broadcast had contained. The modifications were small enough to be effectively invisible to anyone who was not already aware of them. But the fact of the modifications is worth thinking about, because the modifications were made precisely at the point where the episode's content served the story's meaning most directly. The nudity in natural-born kissers is not incidental to the episode. It is not a shock effect deployed independently of the story's logic. It is the story's conclusion. Homer and Marge being naked together in public is the extreme version of the intimacy the episode has been tracking throughout, the endpoint of the arc that began with the premise. Remove the nudity, or soften its presentation, and you soften the arc. The story becomes less itself. This is the consistent problem with content modifications that target specific moments rather than the whole. They leave the structure of the episode intact while removing the elements that give the structure its meaning. The episode can still be watched and still be enjoyed and still be understood as a story about Homer and Marge and their marriage. But the version that emerges from the modification is slightly less true to its own premise, slightly less willing to follow its logic all the way to where it was always going. The UK modifications to natural-born kissers are a mild version of this problem. They are worth discussing not because they were dramatic or because they represent a significant act of suppression, but because they illustrate in miniature a dynamic that runs through the show's entire international broadcast history. Every market, every regulator, Every broadcaster that made any modification to any episode of The Simpsons was operating on the same underlying logic. This specific moment exceeds what we will broadcast as made, and we will adjust it to something we will broadcast, and the adjustment will be invisible to most of the audience receiving it. The adjustments accumulate over 35 seasons and hundreds of episodes, distributed across dozens of countries. The cumulative gap between the show as made and the show as seen across all its markets is enormous. Most of that gap is undocumented and undiscoverable. The minor modifications in the UK are just the visible surface of a much larger body of invisible adjustment. What the natural-born kissers situation adds to the picture is a specific example of the modification being applied to an element of content that was not gratuitous, that was not included for shock or for its own sake, but that was structurally necessary to the episode's argument. The nudity is what the story is building toward. Modifying it is modifying the story. The modification is not neutral. Homer and Marge at the end of that field, exposed and ridiculous and together in front of thousands of strangers who have absolutely no idea what to make of them, that image is the episode's thesis. The marriage is worth the ridicule. The exposure is worth the risk. The being seen, naked and imperfect and still choosing each other, is the whole point. That is what some audiences were not allowed to see in its full form. Not because anyone thought the marriage wasn't worth celebrating, but because the way the episode chose to celebrate it was, in certain broadcasting contexts, more than what the context would allow. Section 7. Sideshow Bob, Springfield, and the episodes that disappeared from memory. The Simpsons has a character named Hans Moleman. He is tiny, elderly, nearly blind, and appears in the background of Springfield scenes primarily to suffer. He gets hit by cars. He gets crushed by falling objects. He is buried alive, struck by lightning, eaten by animals, set on fire, and subjected to a variety of other catastrophic physical events that in any non-cartoon universe would be lethal. He dies, by conservative estimate, dozens of times across the show's run. Not in the specials, not in dream sequences, but in regular canonical episodes. He dies and then appears again in the next episode completely unaffected, with no memory of the death and no indication that anything has happened. This is played as a running gag. Moleman suffers because Moleman is what the show uses when it needs a small piece of background tragedy for comic effect. He has become so associated with background suffering that his appearances function almost as a visual shorthand. Moleman is here, something terrible is about to happen to him, and the something terrible is the joke. But Moleman's repeated deaths are not the most interesting thing about him for our purposes tonight. The most interesting thing is that he once stated his age as 31 years old. 31. Look at him and consider what 31 years would have had to do to a person to produce the physical state he appears to be in when you look at him. He is the most comprehensively aged person in Springfield, and he has been alive for 31 years. This is not a continuity error. The show makes the joke deliberately. Moleman's apparent age and his stated age are irreconcilably different, and the show puts this gap in front of you and waits for you to notice it and find it funny, because something has done to Hans Moleman what nothing should be able to do in 31 years. Something has compacted a full lifetime of decay into 3 decades. Something has made him old before his time, in a way that the town of Springfield accepts without question and without concern. The radiation theory has an answer for this, as it has answers for most things in Springfield. The coma theory has its own answer. But what Moleman's situation illustrates in the specific context of tonight's discussion is the way the show embeds information that it will never address directly, information that sits in the background of every scene it appears in, and waits for an audience paying close enough attention to find it. The episodes that got banned were, in many cases, the episodes where this kind of embedded information got close enough to the surface that someone with the power to push it back down chose to do so. This section is about a category of that phenomenon that doesn't fit neatly into any of the specific episode stories we've been telling tonight. The episodes that were never formally banned, never pulled from a schedule with a public announcement, never the subject of a diplomatic incident or a legal threat, but that nonetheless exist in a state of reduced accessibility, because the specific thing they were trying to say made the people controlling their distribution uncomfortable enough to ensure that saying it remained difficult. There are a number of episodes across the show's run that fall into this category, and they share a quality that distinguishes them from the clear-cut bands. They were not removed. They were allowed to exist. But they were not promoted, not highlighted, not included in the official discussions of the show's best work, not the episodes that the network or the studio pointed at when they wanted to celebrate what the show had accomplished. They exist in the catalog the way an embarrassing relative exists at a family reunion, present, not hidden, but also not introduced to anyone new. The Principal and the Pauper is the most famous example. Though its suppression is more cultural than institutional, the episode was never banned by anyone, but it was so thoroughly rejected by the fan community that its existence in the catalog feels almost ghostly. The episode reveals that Principal Skinner, the man who has run Springfield Elementary for the show's entire run, is an imposter. His real name is Armin Tamzarian. The real Seymour Skinner, a Vietnam War veteran who was captured, survived, escaped, and came home to find his identity had been stolen, shows up and the town has to decide what to do about it. The town's decision is remarkable. They vote to keep the lie. The real Skinner is physically expelled from Springfield, tied to a railroad car and removed from the town. The judge makes it explicitly illegal to ever mention the truth again. The imposter resumes his stolen life, and Springfield continues as before. The episode is not banned. It is in the official catalog. It airs in syndication. But it is the most consistently reviled episode in the show's history, derided in fan discussions since its original broadcast in 1997, as the moment the show definitively stopped caring about its own continuity and its own characters. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, has publicly expressed his unhappiness with the storyline. The critical consensus treats the episode as a failure, an aberration, a thing that should not have happened. What is interesting about this consensus is what it misses. The episode is not a failure in terms of what it is doing. It is disturbing in the specific way it intends to be disturbing. The town's decision to expel the truth and criminalize its mention is not lazy writing. It is a precise articulation of the mechanism by which Springfield operates, the mechanism by which a community collectively decides what it knows and what it forgets. The Principal and the Pauper shows you that mechanism operating in daylight, openly, with a judge and a decree and the physical removal of the man whose presence made the truth visible. The fan community's rejection of the episode is, in a sense, the community doing exactly what the episode depicts the town doing. The episode revealed something uncomfortable about what The Simpsons was, and the response was to try to expel it from the record, to declare it non-canonical in spirit, if not in fact, to treat its existence as something that the show did wrong, rather than something the show did deliberately. There are other episodes like this throughout the show's history. Episodes that said something the official narrative of the show found uncomfortable and were subsequently treated as aberrations rather than data points. Episodes that pushed at the premise of the show in ways that the show was not entirely prepared to support publicly. Episodes that exist in the catalog but that the show's own retrospective self-presentation tends to skip over in favor of safer highlights. These are the soft banned episodes. The ones that didn't disappear but that were made to feel like they should have. The ones that the show itself, in its ongoing public life, has chosen not to illuminate. Section 8. The Prediction Problem. Why the banned episodes matter to what the show says about time. There is a version of the banned episode story that reduces it to a set of isolated incidents. The Michael Jackson episode was removed because of a documentary. The New York episode was pulled because of a tragedy. The Brazil episode generated complaints because of stereotyping. Each incident is its own story, with its own cause and its own resolution, and the stories don't necessarily connect to each other. But there is another version of the story that sees all of it as part of the same argument, because all of it is about the same thing. What happens when a television show running long enough says something true about the world, and the world decides that particular truth is inconvenient to have said? The Simpsons ran long enough to say a lot of things. It ran long enough to say some of them before the things they were about became the things they are now recognized as being about. The Trump presidency episode from the year 2000 is the most frequently cited example of this, because it is the most dramatic. The show depicted a Trump presidency as a joke about the logical extreme of celebrity politics, and then, 16 years later, the logical extreme arrived. The internet's response to that coincidence was the prediction narrative. The idea that The Simpsons somehow foresaw the future, that its writers had prophetic insight, that the show was telling us things about where the world was going that we should have been paying more attention to. The show's own creative team has consistently pushed back on this narrative. Al Jean's explanation is blunt. If you throw enough darts, you're going to hit some bullseyes. With nearly 800 episodes and thousands of satirical observations about American culture, technology, and politics, some of them are going to align with future events through statistical probability alone. It is not prophecy, it is volume. This is the correct explanation. It is also, in its way, incomplete, because it addresses the coincidences, but not the mechanism that makes the coincidences possible. The Simpsons did not predict the Trump presidency, but it did observe, in 2000, that American celebrity culture and American political culture had been moving toward each other for decades, and it depicted the logical endpoint of that convergence as a satirical joke. The joke worked for the audience of 2000 because the audience of 2000 could see the convergence happening, even if they couldn't see where it was going to end up. The joke made the destination visible by being funny about the direction. This is the mechanism. Not prophecy. Something more interesting than prophecy. The systematic observation of trends far enough in advance of their culmination that the observation looks, in retrospect, like it was watching the future. The show was not watching the future. It was watching the present more carefully than most people were watching it, and noting the directions things were moving, and following those directions to their conclusions. Why does this matter to the banned episode story? Because the episodes that got banned were, almost without exception, the episodes that were following some direction to its conclusion. They were the episodes doing the work of systematic observation and honest depiction with enough accuracy and enough specificity that someone with power over the content found the accuracy and the specificity intolerable. Stark Raving Dad followed the direction of Michael Jackson's identity, the way the man and the image had diverged, the way the persona had consumed the person, the way the question of who he actually was had become genuinely unanswerable toward a conclusion that was, in retrospect, both artistically remarkable and deeply complicated. The documentary that removed it from the catalog was itself the continuation of that story. The episode and its removal are both chapters in the same narrative about identity and performance, and the costs of certain kinds of fame. The City of New York episode was following the direction of New York as a city, its energy and its specificity and the way it resists the attempts of visitors who arrive with preconceptions to see it clearly. The tragedy that removed the episode from syndication was also about New York, about the city's specific vulnerability, about the way its scale and its prominence made it a target, about the cost of being the most visible thing in a landscape of resentment. The episode and the event that ended it are both, at some level, about the same city. The Brazil episode was following the direction of how American media depicts non-American cultures, and the complaint it generated was the direction revealing itself as more consequential than a purely comedic framing would prefer. The joke about Rio and the diplomatic incident it caused are both expressions of the same underlying reality, that American popular culture has a history of depicting the developing world in ways that serve American assumptions rather than depicting realities, and that the people on the receiving end of those depictions notice and care. Homer's phobia was following the direction of American homophobia, its specific domestic, middle-class, well-meaning but harmful texture toward a conclusion that the network did not want to air. The fight to get the episode made and the episode's subsequent reception as groundbreaking television are both expressions of the same underlying movement in American culture, the movement toward the recognition that gay people deserve to be depicted as full human beings in mainstream entertainment. The banned episodes are the show's most accurate observations. The ones that got banned are the ones that followed directions far enough that the truth at the end of the direction was uncomfortable for people with the power to make discomfort go away. That is what the prediction phenomenon and the ban history have in common. Both are stories about the show seeing something clearly and following it to where it was going. Sometimes the following produces a joke that turns out to be a forecast. Sometimes it produces an episode that turns out to be a target. Both are the result of the same quality, the willingness to look at things directly and follow them to their conclusions, regardless of where the conclusions lead. Section 9. Behind the Laughter, the episode that looked at itself. Season 11, Episode 22. The 21st of May 2000. The finale of Season 11. The episode is structured as a VH1 behind the music parody, which means it is structured as a confessional documentary. The Simpson family sits for interviews. They reflect on the early years of the show, the breakthrough success, the peak, the collapse, the recovery. The format requires the appearance of candor, and the episode delivers the appearance of candor, and the gap between the appearance and the actual thing is where the episode's most interesting material lives. VH1's Behind the Music was one of the signature television formats of the late 1990s. The show profiled rock and pop musicians in a template so consistent it became a parody of itself before anyone had to write the parody. The humble beginnings, the first break, the rise, the success, the moment where success becomes something poisonous, the dissolution, and then usually the tentative redemption. Every episode followed the arc because the arc was the argument the show was making, that fame and success in popular music are not stable conditions. They are peaks, and peaks precede descents, and the descent is usually where the real story is. Behind the Laughter applies this template to the Simpsons family. Homer reflects on the grueling schedule and the physical demands of performing his character week after week for years on end. Marge discusses the anxiety she managed through the show's run and the medication she took to manage it. Bart talks about what early childhood fame does to a person's sense of self, and the specific ways that growing up in the middle of a public performance distorts the development of a private one. Lisa describes the loneliness of being the most intellectually serious person in a context that rewards spectacle and does not reward seriousness. The tone is the behind the music tone, confessional, slightly sad, looking back at things that were good with the knowledge that the good things had costs that weren't visible while they were happening. And the episode is funny. It is a good piece of television. The format parody works cleanly, and the jokes land with the precision that the show brought to its best self-aware moments. But the episode as broadcast is not the episode that was being made. The original conception involved a more direct engagement with the reality of The Simpsons as a production. Not the fictional reality of the Simpson family as characters in a fictional television show, but the actual reality of the show as a product made by specific people in specific circumstances for specific financial interests. There were plans for jokes about the show's relationship with Fox. There were references to contract negotiations that had been real and contentious features of the show's history during certain periods. There were moments that reached toward genuine autobiographical honesty rather than the safely fictionalized version of honesty that the format parody allowed. These elements were modified or removed. The notes process engaged extensively with this episode for reasons that are not difficult to understand. An episode about the show was also, necessarily, an episode about the network and the studio, and the network and the studio had their own views about what should be said about them on a television show they controlled. The process of removing what could not be said produced an episode that reached toward honesty at every point and pulled back just before it got there. The episode is full of the shapes of the things it wanted to say, visible in the space left by the things that were removed. Homer reflecting on the demands of the schedule without being specific about who set the schedule or what the financial terms were. Marge discussing the anxiety of the show's run without being able to identify the source of the anxiety in the specific relationships between the creative team and the institutional forces they were working within. The episode is honest up to the point where honesty would create real-world consequences for specific people with real-world power. At that point, the episode finds somewhere else to look. This is the quietest form of ban in the show's history, not the removal of an episode from a streaming service. Not the diplomatic incident generated by a foreign government's complaint, not the formal response to a national tragedy, just the accumulated weight of the notes process, operating invisibly, shaping what survived the editing room into the version that the network was willing to put on the air. The version that aired is still good. It is still worth watching. The VH1 parody works and the cast performs it beautifully, and the jokes are genuinely funny. But there is, for anyone who thinks about what the episode was trying to do and what the show's history looked like from the inside at the time it was made, a sadness in how much it was reaching for and how little it was allowed to hold on to. Behind the Laughter is the show at its most openly self-conscious about what making television for 35 years actually costs. And the episode that resulted is, appropriately, the one that demonstrates most clearly what the cost of making television for a network that controls what you can say about making television actually looks like. The truth is in the trying. The modification is in the arrival. The gap between them is where the band lived, quietly, in the conference rooms where notes were given and received, and argued over and eventually resolved in the direction of the entity with the most leverage. Section 10. The Apu Situation, when the archive becomes the controversy. In 2017, Hari Kondabolu released a documentary called The Problem with Apu. It is a calm, specific, rigorously argued film about what happens to South Asian Americans when one of the primary images of South Asian experience in mainstream American popular culture is a heavily accented caricature voiced by a white actor. Kondabolu is a comedian, he is funny, and he structures the documentary with the rhythm of someone who understands how to hold an audience. He does not lecture, he does not perform outrage. He interviews a range of South Asian Americans about their experience of growing up in America with Apu as one of the things their classmates, their coworkers, and the culture at large could point at when they wanted to reference South Asian identity. The interviews are specific and personal, and the specificity is what makes them land. The thing Kondabolu was documenting is the thing about casual stereotyping that is hardest to see from the inside of the culture producing it. The stereotype does not feel harmful to the people creating it because the people creating it are not the people receiving it. The white writers in the room who developed Apu's character, who wrote his lines, who found in the accent a reliable source of jokes, were not the South Asian children in American schools who had the accent performed at them as mockery, who had Apu's catchphrases used to summarize their entire cultural identity, who grew up understanding that one of the ways American popular culture had chosen to represent people who looked like them was as a source of comedy at their expense. The gap between the creator's experience of the character and the receiver's experience of the character is the thing the documentary was trying to make visible, and it did make it visible. Clearly, specifically, in enough detail that the argument was difficult to dismiss on its merits. The show's response was not equal to the argument. The writers addressed it in a season 29 episode with a metatextual moment in which Lisa and Marge discuss the controversy. Marge tells Lisa that perhaps some things will have to change. Lisa says she doesn't know what to do about it, looks at the camera, and says the show doesn't either. The moment was read broadly as dismissive as the show treating the testimony of people who had been harmed by a representation as an interesting creative problem rather than as a genuine moral failure requiring genuine response. The backlash to the meta-response was significant. The people whose experiences the documentary had centered found, watching the episode, that the show had absorbed their criticism and turned it into material in a way that reproduced the original dynamic rather than addressing it. The people in the room making the jokes were still the people in the room making the jokes. Hank Azaria's response was different from the show's institutional response, and it is worth being specific about this because the difference matters. Azaria stopped voicing the character. He engaged with South Asian American communities about the harm the character had caused. He issued a public apology that was specific rather than general. He has spoken about the experience of having participated in something harmful without understanding its harmfulness, and about the process of trying to reckon with that after the understanding arrived. The reckoning Azaria undertook is the harder and more honest version of the response the show, as an institution, mostly declined to engage in. It is the response that looks at the thing that was done, accepts that the not understanding at the time is not the same as not having done harm, and tries to account for the harm as honestly as the accounting can be done. Apu now appears very rarely in new episodes. The character has not been officially retired or written out or killed off within the narrative. He exists in a liminal state, a character who was central to the show's cast for decades and who is now almost invisible, present occasionally in background shots but no longer given storylines or significant screen time. The episodes from the show's earlier seasons that feature Apu prominently remain on streaming services and in the syndication catalog. They have not been edited or removed. The historical record of the character stands intact because removing it would distort the record in a way that erasing the evidence of a mistake often does. It would make it harder to understand what happened and why, rather than easier. But the Apu situation introduced something to the show's content controversy history that had not been there before in quite the same form. The acknowledgement, however imperfect and however reluctantly arrived at, that the show had done something harmful. that a specific creative decision made over decades of production had contributed to a form of harm that real people experienced in the real world. That the fictional representation had non-fictional consequences. Every other controversy in the show's history has involved external forces making claims about what the show was doing wrong. Governments, networks, legal teams, grieving communities. The Apu situation involves something different, the slow accumulation of a recognition from within the culture that had produced the show, that one of the show's long-standing fixtures had been built on something that was not simply exaggerated for comic effect but was genuinely damaging, in the specific, documented way that Kondabolu's documentary demonstrated. That recognition is uncomfortable in a different way from the discomfort of a diplomatic incident. A diplomatic incident can be resolved with a statement and a legal assessment. The recognition that something you made for 30 years caused real harm to real people does not resolve. It stays. It has to be lived with and accounted for, not once and definitively, but continuously, over time. The Apu situation is ongoing. Its lesson is still being articulated, but the basic shape of what it reveals is already clear. A show that ran long enough to see the assumptions of its early seasons become the controversies of its later ones. A show that had to discover, as most long-running things eventually have to discover, that the culture does not stay still while the thing keeps going, and that what was acceptable at the beginning is not always acceptable at the end, and that the gap between the beginning and the end is a measure of something real. Section 11. The Treehouse of Horror Problem. When the rules don't apply and everyone gets nervous. Every Halloween since 1990, The Simpsons has produced a Treehouse of Horror special. The specials are explicitly outside the show's main continuity. They operate under different rules. Characters die and come back. The laws of physics that the show usually observes, however loosely, are suspended. The tone shifts from the show's characteristic warm-hearted cynicism towards something closer to genuine horror, or at least to the playful horror of a Halloween costume scary in the way that Halloween is scary, which is to say, not entirely seriously, but not entirely not seriously either. The specials have been, across the show's history, among the most consistently excellent things the show has produced. The freedom that comes from explicit non-continuity is creatively liberating. The writers can kill characters, can take the show's premises to their actual extremes, can engage with the horror genre with the specific kind of loving parody that the show has always done best, the kind that understands its subject deeply enough to exaggerate it precisely. The specials also, consistently, require more broadcaster intervention internationally than any other category of Simpsons content. The reason is straightforward. The specials go further. They have always gone further. The violence is more explicit. The horror imagery is more intense. The content that the show's regular narrative manages through implication and restraint is given room to be itself in the specials, because the explicit Halloween framing provides the context that makes the more extreme content functional as comedy rather than gratuitous. In markets where the show's regular episodes were broadcast without significant modification, the specials routinely required either time shifting to later night slots, content advisories, or, in some cases, the editing of specific segments. The editing was usually minor, a few seconds removed from the most viscerally intense moments, but it was applied consistently enough across enough markets to constitute a pattern. This pattern tells you something specific about where the show's content actually lived in relation to various broadcasting standards. The regular episodes operated within the tolerance of most markets' content requirements for family hour television. The specials pushed past that tolerance in specific and predictable ways, and the broadcasting systems responded predictably to the pushback. The interesting implication is that the specials were operating at the real edge of what The Simpsons was capable of, in terms of how far it was willing to go with violence and horror and the specific extremity that the Halloween context allowed. The regular episodes were the show in its managed form. The specials were the show with the management partially suspended, and the management's partial suspension was, every year, enough to make international broadcasters nervous. There is a Season 5 special Treehouse of Horror 4 that contains a segment called The Devil and Homer Simpson, in which Homer sells his soul to the devil for a donut. The segment is genuinely funny and has a lovely final joke, but it also involves a depiction of hell and of the devil that is specific enough in its visual language to generate concerns in certain religious broadcasting contexts about the appropriateness of the depiction for family viewing. The devil and damnation imagery that reads as playful horror comedy in a secular American context reads differently in broadcasting markets, where the religious content of the imagery has a different weight. This is a consistent subtext in the special's international broadcast history. The specials use horror genre conventions, including supernatural horror conventions, that in certain cultural contexts are not conventional at all, because the supernatural is not genre, but theology. The vampire segment of one special, the zombie segment of another, the various visits to hell and encounters with supernatural entities, these elements carry different valences in different cultural contexts, and the broadcasting systems in those contexts respond accordingly. The specials are not banned anywhere in the way that Stark Raving Dad is banned. They continue to be broadcast in most markets where the show has distribution, but they continue to require more active management from broadcasters in more markets than the regular episodes require, and the pattern of that management tells you where the real edges of the show's content actually are. Section 12. What banning reveals the final accounting? We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. The room is quieter now than it was when we started. The specific kind of quiet that settles in at this hour, when the urgency of the earlier part of the night has given way to something slower and more reflective. This is the right hour for what I want to say now, because what I want to say now is not about any specific episode or any specific ban. It is about the pattern, about what the whole shape of the thing reveals when you look at it from far enough away to see all of it at once. Here is the first thing the pattern reveals. The episodes that get banned are not usually the bad ones. Think about what we've gone through tonight. Stark Raving Dad, The City of New York versus Homer Simpson, Homer's Phobia, Behind the Laughter, The Principal and the Pauper. These are not the show's failures. They are not the episodes that critics and fans point at as evidence of the show's decline. They are, most of them, either among the show's most celebrated achievements, or they are episodes that were trying to do something ambitious and interesting and getting somewhere with it. The episodes that get banned are usually the ones that were trying hardest, the ones that followed a direction far enough that the truth at the end of the direction was uncomfortable for someone with the power to make discomfort disappear. Homer's Phobia was banned almost, nearly killed before it could be made because it was trying to say something honest about homophobia in American family life. It survived because the creative team was willing to fight for it, and it became the Emmy-winning episode that it is because the honesty was allowed to stay in. The ban attempt and the success are the same story. The fight for the episode and the excellence of the episode are the same fight. Stark Raving Dad was removed because the world changed around it in a way that nobody could have anticipated when it was made. The episode's removal is not evidence that it was bad. It is evidence that it was made in a close enough collaboration with a human being whose subsequent history became impossible to separate from the thing it produced. The removal is a kind of grief, even if it is also a kind of decision. The City of New York episode was pulled from syndication by grief itself, by the collective, distributed decision of a broadcasting industry that understood, without needing to be told, that certain images had become too painful to look at for a period. The episode was not banned because it was wrong about the city or wrong about Homer or wrong about anything. It was banished temporarily by the force of what the city had gone through, and it came back when enough time had passed for the force of the event to be something that could coexist with the episode's existence. Behind the Laughter was modified by the quiet, internal ban of the notes process, which removed the most honest elements of the episode's self-examination and produced a version of the episode that is good but not as good as the version it was trying to be. This is the most pervasive form of ban in the show's history, the ban that happens before the episode airs, in the rooms where notes are given and received, in the pressure applied through the institutional process to say things safely rather than saying them truly. The Apu situation is the ban that comes from within the culture, rather than from above it, the gradual recognition that something the show had been doing for decades had been doing real harm, and the incomplete, imperfect, ongoing attempt to reckon with that harm without simply erasing the evidence of it. All of these are different. All of them operate through different mechanisms and are motivated by different forces and produce different outcomes. The ban that comes from a network's content review is not the same as the ban that comes from a national tragedy, and neither is the same as the ban that comes from a production company's voluntary decision to remove its own work from the accessible record. But they are all, in the end, about the same thing. What a society is willing to look at, and what it needs to be protected from seeing, and who gets to make that decision, and whether the decision serves the people it claims to protect, or whether it serves the people making it. The episodes that get banned are the evidence in this case. They are the data points that let you trace the shape of the protective mechanisms, the networks and regulators and governments and institutions that decide, for various reasons, that certain things should not be easy to see. When you look at the pattern of what gets removed, you see the shape of the things that the people with power over the content most wanted to avoid having to answer for. The network that tried to kill Homer's phobia was answering for its advertiser relationships and its regulatory exposure and its discomfort with the subject. The broadcasters that pulled the New York episode were answering for the grief of the people watching their screens and the impossibility of asking those people to laugh at certain images while that grief was still total. The production company that removed Stark Raving Dad was answering for the testimony of people who said they had been harmed and the impossibility of continuing to make the harm's collaborator easily available. Each of these answers says something about the people doing the answering, about what they were afraid of, and what they were protecting, and what they thought the audience needed and didn't need, and what they were willing to take responsibility for. The second thing the pattern reveals is that the audience is almost never the person being protected. When a network tries to kill an episode like Homer's phobia, it is not protecting the audience from something harmful. It is protecting its advertiser relationships from the political risk of being associated with content that might generate controversy. The audience, in this equation, is not the object of the protection. It is the leverage, the thing the advertisers are buying access to, the thing the protection of which justifies the protection of the institutional interests. When a foreign government makes a diplomatic complaint about an episode, it is not protecting its citizens from harmful stereotypes. It is protecting its national reputation in the global media landscape from the impact of a specific representation. The citizens who are actually affected by the stereotypes, the people who are called Apu in the street, who have the accent performed at them, who see their cultural identity reduced to a punchline, are rarely the ones whose interests drive the institutional response. The third thing the pattern reveals is that the most persistent form of ban is also the most invisible. The formal bans, the removals, the diplomatic incidents, the legal threats, the network kills are documentable. They generate press coverage. They enter the historical record. The stories we have been telling tonight are the stories of the visible bans, the ones that left enough evidence to be tracked. But the invisible modifications, the notes process adjustments, the localization changes that strip context without acknowledgement, the quiet decisions by individual broadcasters to time shift or edit specific moments without any public announcement are vastly more pervasive. Every market that received a modified version of the show without being told it had been modified, every episode where the notes process produced a version slightly less true to what the episode was trying to be. Every scene that was written and shot and cut before it could air, leaving a shape in the finished episode where something was supposed to be. Those invisible modifications, accumulated across 35 seasons and 60 countries and hundreds of episodes, constitute a revision of the show that is larger and more significant than all the formal bans put together. The show most people have seen is not the show that was made. It is the show that survived the process of being made in an institutional context that has always had preferences about what it preferred to say. This is not unique to The Simpsons. It is true of almost all television, almost all popular culture distributed at any significant scale. The commercial distribution of cultural products requires the cooperation of institutions that have interests in what those products say, and those interests shape the products in ways that are mostly invisible to the people consuming them. What makes The Simpsons a particularly useful lens for seeing this is the combination of longevity and ambition. The show has been running long enough to accumulate a rich, documentable history of these negotiations. It has been ambitious enough, across enough of its history, to generate real friction with the institutional forces it was navigating. The friction is the evidence. The bans and the fights and the modifications and the diplomatic incidents are the visible residue of a process that usually happens without leaving any visible residue at all. The show was trying to say things. The world kept negotiating with what it was allowed to say. The negotiation produced the show we have, which is not the show that was being made, but is the show that survived the making. Homer still drives home from work. The couch gag still plays. Bart is still at the chalkboard. The family still ends up on the couch, together, by the end of every episode, no matter what the episode has put them through. The loop holds. The family persists. Springfield stays exactly where it is, which is everywhere and nowhere, which is the show's way of being honest about what it actually is. The banned episodes are part of Springfield too. The removed and the restricted and the modified and the fought over, they are the rooms in the house that the official tour doesn't take you to, but they are there. And if you go looking, you can find them. That's worth knowing. That's worth taking with you when you leave. Thank you for spending this time here tonight. If you've made it to the end, subscribe if you haven't yet. There's more of this to come, and you should be here for it. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is, because I genuinely want to know who's out there in the dark with me. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. End of script. Expanded section. 1 continuation. Stark Raving Dad, the deeper story. What we haven't fully explored about Stark Raving Dad is the production context that surrounded it, because the production context explains some things about why the episode landed the way it did and why it was allowed to be made at all. Season 3 of The Simpsons was a pivotal period. The show had survived its first 2 seasons, which were not entirely smooth. The animation in Season 1 was rough, in ways that the show's creators found embarrassing in retrospect. The characterization was still finding its footing. Homer in particular had a harder edge in the earliest episodes than he would develop more genuinely abrasive, less the specific combination of incompetent and loving that would become the engine of the show's emotional logic. The show knew what it was doing with the comedy before it knew what it was doing with the heart. Season 3 is the season where the heart arrived fully. The season premiere, Stark Raving Dad, is the clearest announcement that the show had figured out how to hold genuine feeling and genuine comedy in the same frame without letting one cancel the other. The scene of Leon singing the birthday song to Lisa is the moment that announced what the next several seasons would be capable of, the specific ability to make you laugh and then, before the laughter has faded, to make you feel something real. The writer's room in this period was functioning at an unusual level of collective creative intelligence. The Harvard Lampoon Pipeline had delivered a group of writers who were academically rigorous, well-read, and committed to a kind of comedy that operated at multiple levels simultaneously. They were not interested in making a show that was just funny. They were interested in making a show that was funny and true. The truth was the part that required the comedy to do more work, to be more specific, to understand its subjects well enough to find the real exaggerations rather than the easy ones. The decision to reach out to Michael Jackson was consistent with this ambition. Having the voice of the actual Michael Jackson perform a character who claimed to be Michael Jackson but was demonstrably not was a comedic premise with genuine philosophical depth, an actual instance of what it means to have an identity that belongs to you when identity can apparently be adopted and performed by someone else. The premise was the joke and also the argument and also, in retrospect, something uncomfortably close to a portrait of a man whose real relationship to his own persona was genuinely complex in ways that the episode, made in 1991, could not have fully anticipated. Jackson's participation was secured through his personal enthusiasm for the show, and his enthusiasm was allowed to remain at the level of an open secret rather than a public announcement. The John J. Smith credit was the show's way of acknowledging the fiction while maintaining it. Both the show and Jackson understood the game they were playing. The audience was not deceived in any meaningful sense. Everyone involved was winking. What made the collaboration work, apart from Jackson's own extraordinary commitment to the voice performance, was the way the episode used his voice rather than his celebrity. The character of Leon Kompowski does not function as a celebrity cameo. He is not there to be a version of Michael Jackson that the audience is supposed to find thrilling because Michael Jackson is famous. He is there because the voice provides the specific quality of warmth and gentleness that the episode needed for the birthday song to work, and for the revelation at the end to land with the emotional weight it needed to carry. Jackson understood this. He understood it clearly enough to perform the character with complete restraint, not pushing the fame, not winking at the audience's knowledge of who was really speaking, just inhabiting the character with the specific qualities the character required. Leon Kompowski needed to be genuinely kind. Jackson was genuinely kind in the performance. The kindness came through the voice and made the episode possible. The birthday song itself deserves considerably more attention than it usually receives in discussions of the episode, because the songwriting choices reveal a great deal about what the production was trying to do and what it understood about the emotional terrain it was navigating. The song is not a great song in any conventional musical sense. It is simple, almost to the point of being rudimentary. The structure is basic. The lyrics are direct to the edge of being plain. There is nothing technically impressive about it. But these qualities are exactly the qualities the episode needed it to have, because a technically impressive song would have been the wrong song for this moment. A technically impressive song would have been about the song. The song the episode needed had to be about the giving of the song about Bart's imperfect, earnest, slightly inadequate attempt to make his sister feel seen. The simplicity of the song is the honesty of the gesture. If the song were better, it would suggest that someone competent had made it. The slight roughness of it, the way the melody doesn't quite do what great melodies do, is the evidence that a 10-year-old boy wrote it because a big man from New Jersey helped him, and neither of them is a professional songwriter, and the song reflects this accurately. The gift is genuine precisely because the gift is not polished. It is the effort, not the result. Jackson singing the harmonies to that effort, the professional voice behind the amateur sentiment, is what makes the scene work in a way it would not work without him. The contrast between the simplicity of the song and the beauty of the voice is itself the emotional content. Something extraordinary is being offered in service of something ordinary and important, and the offering is so completely without ego that it transforms both. This is what makes the episode, when you watch it now knowing everything that happened afterward, so complicated to sit with. Because the quality in that performance, the absolute service of the voice to the moment, the complete absence of any attempt to draw attention to itself, the genuine warmth and gentleness in every note is, whatever else is true about the man behind the voice, a real thing, a beautiful thing. The performance is beautiful in a way that is not diminished by its context, and its beauty being not diminished by its context is part of what makes the context so difficult. The show's creators were not wrong to make the episode. They were not wrong to collaborate with Jackson. They made something genuinely good, and they made it with someone who contributed to its goodness in a specific and irreplaceable way. The removal of the episode from the accessible record is not a retroactive judgment that the episode was bad or that the collaboration was wrong. It is a decision that the costs of the episode's continued easy availability, in a world where the accusations against Jackson had become impossible to set aside, outweighed the benefits of keeping it in the standard rotation. Reasonable people disagree about whether that judgment was correct. The arguments on both sides are real, and neither is obviously wrong. The show's creators made the call that they made, and they made it based on their own moral accounting, and the accounting was honest even if others might have arrived at different numbers. What we are left with is an episode that exists in memory and in the archive, available to those who look for it, but absent from the places where most people encounter the show without looking. An episode that was one of the best things the show ever made, built around a collaboration that is now impossible to discuss without the discussion, including things the episode itself could not have known it would have to include. Leon Kompowski walked down the street at the end of that episode as a free man, no longer tied to anyone else's identity, comfortable in the ordinary life that was actually his. The episode let him go with complete dignity and complete tenderness. The episode itself has not been allowed the same clean exit. Expanded section, 2 continuation, New York. The geography of grief. The thing about the September 11th removal that deserves more attention than it usually receives is what it tells us about the specific mechanism by which collective grief operates in relation to media content. Every city and every culture and every generation has its threshold, experiences the events that divide time into before and after, that change the vocabulary of public feeling, that make certain things impossible to look at without the looking being colored by the knowledge of what came after. These thresholds exist across every scale, from the very personal to the very public, and at every scale they have the same basic effect. They change what existing things mean by changing the context in which the existing things are encountered. The September 11th attacks created a threshold of this kind at a very large scale and very quickly. The speed of the threshold creation was itself part of what made the media response so immediate and so uniform. It was not a gradual reassessment. It was a change that happened over the course of a morning, visible to millions of people as it happened. And by the end of that morning, the context in which all subsequent media consumption would take place had been altered in ways that were already recognizable and already producing their effects on what people were willing and able to watch. The City of New York versus Homer Simpson had specific exposure to this threshold that other content did not have because of the specific content it contained. An episode that featured the World Trade Center as a background presence, as one of many New York landmarks appearing and establishing shots, would have been in a different position. The building's presence in such an episode would have been mournable, difficult to look at, but not structurally central to the episode's comedy. You could still watch the episode. The buildings would hurt to see, but you could watch past them. The Simpsons episode could not be watched past the towers, because the towers were the premise. The parking space between them was why Homer was in Manhattan. The physical gap between those buildings was the comedy's location, the comedy's anchor, the thing the comedy was organized around. The impossibility of watching the episode in September 2001 was not the impossibility of seeing sad images. It was the impossibility of finding funny what was funny about those buildings without the funniness being immediately, completely overwhelmed by the grief of what had happened to them. This distinction matters because it clarifies what kind of removal this was. It was not censorship in the meaningful political sense. Nobody was trying to prevent people from thinking about the World Trade Center. Nobody was trying to suppress information about what had happened or control the narrative around the attacks. The episode was pulled because the episode's comedy was dependent on a premise. The towers are here, they are enormous and solid and permanent. You can park a car between them and complain about getting a ticket that had been made impossible by a specific historical event. The comedy didn't survive the context change. Not because comedy about tragedy is impossible or wrong, but because this specific comedy was organized around the presence of something whose absence had become the dominant fact of public feeling, and the comedy could not coexist with the dominance of that fact while the fact was still in its most acute phase. What makes the episode's return to circulation interesting is what it says about how grief actually operates over time. The episode came back to the standard streaming catalog. It is watchable now. The towers exist in the episode as towers, which is to say as buildings that stood in Lower Manhattan and were part of the visual vocabulary of the city and the country. They are also, for any viewer who knows the history, something else. Images of what was there before, carrying the weight of what came after, but carrying it in a way that the episode's comedy can now coexist with. The grief has not gone away. It has become integrated into the normal weight that serious historical events carry in ongoing cultural life, rather than remaining the acute, overwhelming, totalizing force it was in the immediate aftermath. The episode can be watched again not because the grief is gone, but because the grief is no longer the only thing that can be felt in proximity to images of those buildings. They can be mourned and laughed at in the same moment, which is the territory that comedy and tragedy share when both have become historical rather than immediate. The question of when that transition happened, when the grief became integrated enough that the episode's comedy could coexist with it, is not answerable with precision. There was no announcement, no official date on which broadcasters decided the episode was okay to run again. The decision to return it to circulation was made gradually, by different entities at different times, based on a judgment about when the context had shifted enough to allow it. This is how the most honest kinds of cultural management operate. Not through formal mechanisms and official declarations, but through the distributed sense of what is bearable at a given moment in time. The episode was gone when grief made it impossible to be present. It came back when grief had done what grief does, which is to transform without disappearing, to become part of the ongoing experience of the thing that caused it, rather than remaining the thing's entire experience. Homer's car was waiting for him the whole time, wedged between two buildings that the episode treated with affection and comedy and a specific kind of New York reverence. The car is still there in the episode's world. The buildings are still there in the episode's world. Springfield's geography is always impossible anyway, subject to rules that the regular world is not subject to, which means that in the specific universe of the show, the towers are still standing, will always be standing, because Springfield does not have a September 11th. That is, in its own quiet way, part of what makes the episode survivable. The show exists in an eternal present tense, a permanent loop, a world where the consequences of the real world don't fully arrive. In Springfield, the towers are still there. In the show's impossible geography, the worst things that happen within episodes and are resolved by the credits. That is the thing the show has always offered. Underneath all its satire and all its horror and all its banned episodes and all its complicated history, the promise that by the end of the episode, the family will be on the couch and the world will be the world it was at the start, and nothing will have been permanently broken. That promise is not true of the real world. The real world has a September 11th. The real world has towers that come down and do not go back up. But in Springfield, they are always there. Between them, Homer's car waits. The meter expired hours ago. The ticket has been written. Everything is still wrong and still fixable and still fundamentally okay. Expanded Section 3 continuation Brazil, representation, and the long history behind the joke. What makes the Brazil situation more than just a standard international content controversy is the history that the specific stereotypes in the episode were drawing on, because that history is not a history specific to The Simpsons. It is a history specific to how American popular culture has depicted Latin America for the entire course of the 20th century. And understanding that history puts the episode in a context that the Fox defense of it, its satire, we do the same to everyone consistently failed to acknowledge. American popular culture's relationship to Latin America has been shaped by a set of recurring representational patterns that developed in the early decades of the 20th century and have persisted in various forms through the present day. The patterns are not random. They reflect the specific power relationships between the United States and Latin America, the economic dominance, the history of political intervention, the specific anxieties that American culture developed around the countries to its south, and they have been reproduced so consistently and for so long that they have acquired the quality of obvious truth rather than manufactured. Perception. The Dangerous City is one of the oldest of these patterns. American films about Latin American settings began depicting urban environments in South and Central America as places of colorful chaos long before the Simpsons writers were born, and the specific elements of that chaos, the crime, the disorder, the wildlife that exists in uncomfortable proximity to human habitation, the transgressive sexuality that suggests a culture less inhibited and less organized than American culture are not the Simpsons' inventions. They are the shared vocabulary of 100 years of American popular culture engaging with Latin American settings. When the Simpsons episode deployed these elements, it was not creating a caricature from scratch. It was selecting from an existing menu of available representations and producing the combination that would be funniest to an American audience already primed to receive them. The familiarity was the joke's engine. You laugh at the monkeys and the criminals and the kidnapping because you already have a picture in your mind that the images confirm, and the laughter is the relief of confirmation. This is the mechanism that makes stereotype jokes different from other kinds of exaggeration. Jokes that exaggerate things that are genuinely true. Homer's stupidity, Springfield's incompetent police, the power plant's safety violations work because the exaggeration reveals something real about the thing being exaggerated. You learn something about the thing. The joke earns its exaggeration. Stereotype jokes work differently. They work because they confirm an existing impression rather than revealing a truth. The audience already believes the stereotyped version of the thing. The joke says, "You're right. Your impression was accurate. What you think about this place is what is true about this place." The confirmation is pleasurable. The pleasure is not the pleasure of insight. It is the pleasure of being told you were already right. This is what Embratur was objecting to with a precision that the Fox defense consistently missed. The tourism board was not saying the show got Brazil wrong in a factual sense, as if there were a set of correct Brazil facts that the show had failed to consult. It was saying the show reproduced a set of existing wrong impressions with enough charm and enough reach to make those wrong impressions more powerful in the minds of more people. It was saying the damage was not just to national pride, but to the actual, practical perception of Brazil in the minds of American audiences who would make decisions based on their perception. Those decisions include travel decisions and investment decisions and policy decisions, and the thousands smaller decisions that accumulate into a country's relationship with the rest of the world. How a country is perceived in American popular culture affects how American companies decide whether to invest there, how American politicians frame policy toward it, how American tourists decide whether to visit it. The perception is not merely a cultural matter. It has material consequences. The tourism board's response was calibrated to the material dimension of the problem. Tour was not a cultural institution making a cultural argument. It was an economic institution making an economic argument. This episode will cost us visitors, and the visitors it will cost us represent real money, and we are going to pursue every available legal avenue to make clear that we hold Fox responsible for that cost. The legal avenue turned out not to be available in the specific form they hoped. American defamation law's protection of satirical speech is strong enough that an episode of The Simpsons was always going to be difficult to pursue, but the argument itself was not trivial. The argument that representations of a country in globally distributed entertainment have measurable economic effects on that country's tourism and investment numbers is well supported by research in media economics. And while the specific quantification of The Simpsons episode's impact on Brazilian tourism is not something anyone has managed to measure with precision, the mechanism the argument describes is real. Fox's position, its satire, "We meant no harm, we did the same to everyone," was defensible in legal terms and inadequate in moral ones. The satire is real. The lack of malicious intent is probably real. The consistency of the treatment across different countries is probably real. None of these things address the asymmetry in how the caricature functions when it is applied to a developing country versus when it is applied to a developed one. None of them address the mechanism by which confirmation of existing stereotypes is different in its effects from fresh exaggeration for comic purposes. The show went back to Brazil in later episodes. The treatment was somewhat more careful. The representation was somewhat less reliant on the most loaded existing stereotypes. The relationship between the show and the country it had initially depicted as a danger zone evolved over time into something that, while still not perfect, showed at least the residue of having been confronted with the criticism and having partially absorbed it. The Brazil episode remains in the catalog. It remains uncomfortable if you watch it while thinking about what it was doing and why it was doing it. The discomfort is evidence that the criticism it received was not entirely misplaced. Expanded Section 4 Continuation. Homer's Phobia. What the Emmy missed. The Emmy win for Homer's Phobia was recognition that the episode had done something exceptional. But the categories available for that recognition, Outstanding Animated Program, don't fully describe what the episode actually accomplished, which was something considerably more specific than being exceptional animated programming. What the episode accomplished was a demonstration that the specific formal properties of animated satire, the removal from the register of realistic drama, the permission that cartoon characters have to be extreme versions of themselves, the way animation creates distance that allows subjects to be approached, that live action would make too loaded to navigate, could be turned toward a subject that American television had mostly either avoided or handled in ways that didn't particularly illuminate it. American primetime television in 1997 had been having a conversation about gay characters for several years. Ellen DeGeneres had come out on her sitcom in a moment that generated enormous cultural attention. Will and Grace was in development. The landscape was not empty. But most of the conversation was happening in a register that privileged drama and self-seriousness, the coming out moment as a moment of weight and consequence. The gay character as a figure defined primarily by the drama of their sexual orientation in relation to the people around them. What Homer's Phobia did was entirely different. It was not interested in John as a dramatic subject. It was interested in John as a person, someone with a life and a perspective and a sense of humor about the world, who existed within a story that was actually about Homer's psychology. The gay character was not the drama. He was the catalyst for a drama that was about the person who was afraid of him. This inversion, making the gay character the person who is at ease, and making the straight character's anxiety the thing that needs to be worked through, was more radical in 1997 than it might sound now, because it reversed the dramatic convention that had governed most primetime television's handling of gay characters. The convention said, the gay character is the source of drama, because the gay character's existence is itself dramatic. The convention assumed that the interesting story was the story of acceptance, which is a story centered on the feelings of the straight characters, which means a story in which the gay character exists primarily to generate those feelings. Homer's Phobia said, "The interesting story is the story of the person who is afraid, and the gay character's role in that story is to be fully himself while the afraid person works out their fear." John does not have a coming out arc. John does not need to be accepted by Homer in order to be a complete person. John is already a complete person. The question the episode is interested in is whether Homer will be capable of treating him like one. This is a significantly more dignified position for the gay character than the convention allowed, and it is also a significantly more honest portrait of what homophobia actually looks like in people who are not cartoonishly villainous. Homer's homophobia is not hatred. It is discomfort. It is the fear that gay people are somehow contagious, that proximity to them endangers the people you love, that the difference between gay life and straight life is a threat to straight life rather than simply another way of living. This specific, domestic, well-meaning but harmful version of homophobia is enormously common. The episode's willingness to depict it clearly, without either condemning Homer as a monster or excusing his behavior as harmless, is what gives the episode its lasting power. The network was uncomfortable with this precisely because it is not a comfortable portrait. It is a portrait of something familiar, and the familiarity is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is the point. The network wanted a version of the episode that would allow an audience to watch Homer's homophobia from a safe distance, as the behavior of someone unlike themselves, the kind of person who has those backward attitudes. The episode the writers made insisted that the behavior was not exotic, it was ordinary. It was the specific kind of ordinary that a lot of people watching the episode would recognize from their own experience and possibly from their own behavior. That is not a comfortable thing to watch. It is, however, an honest and useful thing to watch, and its honesty and usefulness are exactly what earned the Emmy and exactly what the network spent months trying to prevent from being on television. John Waters, for his part, seems to have understood entirely what the episode was doing and what his role in it was. His performance is calibrated with a precision that reveals how carefully he was engaging with the material. He plays John as someone who has been dealing with the specific kind of discomfort Homer expresses for his entire adult life, who has developed, through necessity, the capacity to meet that discomfort without being destabilized by it, who can be generous toward Homer's fear without minimizing what Homer's fear costs. This is a psychologically accurate portrait of how many gay people have had to move through the world with a patience and a generosity toward the discomfort of the people around them that is sometimes admirable and sometimes exhausting and sometimes both simultaneously. Waters brings this to the performance without making it a speech. It is in the lightness with which John receives Homer's awkwardness, the specific quality of amusement rather than wound, the sense of a person who has found a way to be entertained by something that could alternatively be devastating. That quality, the choice to be entertained rather than wounded, to be amused by the gap between what people fear you will do and who you actually are, is one of the most honest things the episode depicts. And it is, probably, the quality that the network was most uncomfortable with. A gay character who is entertaining and at ease and not defined by his suffering does not confirm the idea that there is anything particularly dramatic about being gay. A gay character who is simply a person, living his life with wit and style and complete comfort with himself, is more radical than a gay character who is the subject of a very special episode about the importance of tolerance. Homer's Phobia is not a very special episode. It is too funny and too specific and too honest about its subject to operate in the register of important social message. It operates in the register of comedy that understands its subject well enough to find the real jokes, the ones that come from genuine observation rather than from the desire to make a safe point safely. That is what earned the Emmy. That is what the network tried to kill. The fact that the two things are the same thing is not a coincidence. Expanded Section 5 Continuation, The Invisible Edit. What translation costs? The conversation about the Arabic Simpsons tends to focus on the specific modifications, the beer becoming soda, the hot dogs becoming halal sandwiches, because these modifications are concrete and easily described and produce the kind of side-by-side comparison that makes the extent of the change visible. But focusing on the individual modifications can obscure what is actually most significant about the localization project, which is not any specific change but the cumulative effect of all the changes together on the show's relationship to its own premise. The Simpsons, at its most fundamental level, is a satire of American consumer culture and American middle-class life in the specific period of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The specific consumer culture it is satirizing is organized around a set of objects and practices that have genuine meaning in the American context. Beer and its role in male sociality, fast food and its role in daily life, the specific architecture of the evangelical church, the specific texture of the suburban relationship to television, to work, to leisure. These are not arbitrary cultural details. They are the cultural details that the show's comedy is built on. They are the material that the satire processes. When the localization removes or replaces these details, it does not produce a culturally neutral version of the show. It produces a version that has been evacuated of the specific cultural content that made the original's comedy meaningful and replaced with substitutes that carry different cultural meanings in the context they are being received. The show that arrives is not The Simpsons in a different language. It is The Simpsons with the specific Americanness replaced with a different cultural context that was not what the show was built to explore. This is not a problem that can be solved through better translation or more thoughtful localization. It is a structural feature of what the show is and what the receiving contexts required. The show was built for a specific cultural audience with specific cultural references. Broadcasting it in a context where those references do not travel required choices about what to do with the references, and the choices that were made replacement rather than explanation, substitution rather than adaptation produced a version that was accessible but was also, in the specific ways that made the original valuable, significantly diminished. The question of what it means to broadcast The Simpsons in markets where the show's cultural specificity cannot travel is genuinely interesting philosophically, because it forces a choice between two different conceptions of what the show actually is. If the show is primarily a set of character relationships and episode plots, then a version that preserves the characters and the plots while replacing the cultural specifics is still The Simpsons, because the core of the thing, the family, their dynamics, their love for each other, and their frustration with each other, and the world that gives them so much trouble, survives the translation. If the show is primarily a cultural artifact, a record of a specific cultural moment in a specific place processed through a satirical lens, then a version that replaces the cultural specifics with alternatives is not really The Simpsons anymore, because the specificity was what gave the cultural observations their accuracy and their edge. Both of these positions have merit. The family is real regardless of what they're drinking. The love between Homer and Marge and the children is not an artifact of American consumer culture. The comedy of the specific character relationships, Homer's incompetent love, Bart's mischievous affection, Lisa's lonely intelligence, Maggie's watchful silence, these things survive translation in ways that the cultural specifics do not, and they are the things that gave the show its global appeal in the first place. But the cultural specificity is not separate from the family. It is the texture in which the family lives. Homer's beer is not just a prop. It is the specific object that places him in the working-class American male social world he belongs to, the world of Moe's Tavern and Lenny and Carl, and the specific pleasures and discontents of that world. When the beer becomes soda, Homer does not simply hold a different beverage. He becomes a person who likes soda very much, which is not a comedy that the show was built to make, because a person who likes soda very much is not a satirical observation about anything in particular. The invisible edit cost the Arabic version of the show exactly this: the satirical precision that made the original valuable. The shows were still watchable and still funny in many ways, because the character relationships and the timing and the visual comedy were preserved. But the specific commentary about American consumer culture, about American working-class male sociality, about the specific relationship between a man and the object he uses to decompress from his job, that commentary could not be preserved without the object, and the object could not be preserved without the cultural context that made it meaningful. So the Arabic version of The Simpsons is a different show than the American one, not just in language, in kind. It is a show that kept the shapes and lost the argument, that kept the characters and lost the specific things the characters were saying about the world they lived in. That kept the jokes and lost the targets of the jokes, substituting targets that were either nothing in particular or targets that the original had not been aiming at. This is the cost of the invisible edit. Not any single modification, but the accumulated effect of all the modifications together. A show that arrives looking like itself but having been quietly, thoroughly evacuated of the specific cultural content that made it matter. Expanded section. 6. Continuation. Natural-born kissers. Bodies, marriage, and the physics of broadcast standards. The more interesting question that natural-born kissers raises, beyond the specific nudity controversy, is the question of what it means that a show about marriage is more likely to face broadcast restrictions than a show about violence. The Simpsons has, throughout its history, contained a significant amount of animated violence. The itchy and scratchy segments alone represent dozens of episodes worth of graphic cartoon killing, with a specificity and an enthusiasm that was deliberately extreme. These segments aired without significant broadcast restriction in most markets. The show's regular narrative has included Homer being shot, electrocuted, falling off cliffs, being hit by cars, and surviving other physical traumas that would be lethal in a non-animated context. The violence has always been there, present and persistent, and fairly explicit by the standards of family hour television. The nudity in natural-born kissers, implied rather than explicit, presented in the specific context of a married couple's intimate life, structured as the culmination of a story about the importance of maintaining that intimate life, generated more broadcast concern in more markets than the itchy and scratchy segments that depicted the same characters being dismembered every week. This is not a surprising phenomenon in the context of American broadcasting history, which has consistently treated violence as more acceptable than sexuality in its content standards. The FCC's rules are notably more restrictive around sexual content than around violent content. The cultural logic that produces this asymmetry violence as appropriate entertainment, sexuality as something requiring special protection, has been discussed at length by media scholars and never satisfactorily resolved, partly because it is not a logical position but a historical one, the product of specific decisions made in specific cultural contexts over decades of broadcasting regulation. But Natural-Born Kissers is not a show about sexuality in the way that provokes content restriction. It is a show about marriage. It is a show about a specific married couple whose sexual life together is an important part of their relationship, and whose maintenance of that sexual life is treated as genuinely important by the episode and by the show's overall emotional architecture. The nudity in the episode is the endpoint of a story about the value of sustaining a marriage, which is about as wholesome a narrative purpose as nudity can serve. The restriction it faced in certain markets was not really about the nudity. It was about the acceptability of depicting adult bodies in family hour television, which is a category of concern that is not much affected by the context in which the bodies appear. The regulatory frameworks that require time shifting or content advisories for nudity in family hour slots do not typically apply the requirements based on the narrative purpose of the nudity. The requirement applies to the category. Homer and Marge naked in a football stadium, in the context of a story about their marriage, falls into the category. The category triggers the requirement. The narrative purpose of the nudity does not affect the requirement's application. This produces an outcome that is, in the specific terms of what the episode is trying to do, slightly absurd. A story whose central argument is that married couples should maintain their physical intimacy is made to justify that argument through a different, more cautious approach to the physical intimacy that is central to its argument. The modification to comply with broadcast standards produces a version of the story that is slightly less true to its own premise. The football stadium scene is the right ending for the story the episode is telling. It is where the logic of the premise leads, and it earns the destination by building consistently toward it across the episode's running time. The nudity is not a shock effect. It is the story's conclusion, the moment where the argument the episode has been making is stated in the clearest possible terms. The marriage is worth this. The exposure is worth the risk. The being seen, imperfectly and together, in front of everyone, is what the whole story was about. When the modification reduces or delays the scene, it reduces or delays the conclusion. The story becomes slightly less conclusive. The argument becomes slightly less clear. The version that complied with the broadcast standards is a version that made the argument less directly, and in making it less directly, made it less itself. This is worth sitting with, because it is a precise example of what broadcast modification actually costs. Not just a moment on the screen, The moment on the screen was carrying the meaning of everything that preceded it, and the modification to the moment diffuses the meaning, softens the conclusion, makes the story slightly more comfortable and slightly less honest about what it was trying to say. Expanded Section 7 Continuation. The Principal and the Pauper. What Springfield Does with Truth. The episode that the fan community most thoroughly rejected is, in retrospect, the episode that told them the most accurate thing about the show they loved. The Principal and the Pauper has been described in fan discussions since its 1997 broadcast as a betrayal of the show's established continuity, a casual erasure of a character's developed identity, and evidence that the writers had stopped caring about the show's internal logic. These criticisms are understandable. They reflect a genuine investment in the show's characters and a reasonable expectation that the investment would be honored. But the episode is not doing what the criticism says it is doing. The episode is not being careless about continuity. It is making a specific argument about how Springfield works, and the argument is more honest and more disturbing than the casual revelation of Skinner's fake identity would have been if the episode were simply being careless. Here is the argument. When a community discovers that one of its foundational stories is false, the community does not pursue the truth. The community chooses the story it prefers over the truth that disrupts it. This is what the town of Springfield does when the real Seymour Skinner arrives. The evidence is overwhelming and present, and the real Skinner is standing right there in the room. Nobody is being deceived. The facts are fully available to everyone. And Springfield looks at the facts and votes to expel them. The legal decree that makes it illegal to discuss the truth is the specific mechanism by which the community formalizes its preference for the lie. The physical expulsion of the real Skinner is the enforcement of that preference. Together, these actions constitute the show's most explicit depiction of the mechanism by which Springfield maintains its impossible reality, not through ignorance, not through forgetfulness, but through deliberate collective choice. This is what the fan community could not accept about the episode, and the inability to accept it is the episode's most accurate prediction. The fan community's rejection of The Principal and the Pauper, the insistence that the episode was wrong, that it shouldn't have happened, that the continuity it disrupted should be restored, is exactly the behavior the episode depicts Springfield engaging in. The episode revealed the mechanism. The audience used the mechanism to deal with the revelation. The real Seymour Skinner, tied to a railroad car and expelled from the community, is still out there somewhere. He is the truth that Springfield chose to exile. And every time a fan declares The Principal and the Pauper to be a non-episode that doesn't count, they are performing the decree that Judge Snyder handed down in the episode's closing minutes. The episode belongs to the broader category of banned things we've been discussing tonight, not because it was formally removed from the catalog, but because the community organized its memory around its absence. It exists. You can watch it. But it has been treated, by the fan community's collective judgment, as something that should not count, should not be referenced, should not be integrated into the show's ongoing mythology. That treatment is itself a form of the thing the show was depicting. Springfield decided that certain truths were less important than the comfortable version of things. The fan community made the same decision about this episode. It remains in the archive, waiting for the right moment, with the patience of things that are true and know it. Expanded Section 8 Continuation. The Prediction Mechanism. How the show saw what it saw. The question of how The Simpsons has managed to produce content that aligns with future events is genuinely interesting once you set aside the supernatural explanation and look at what the writers were actually doing. The show has always been staffed by people who were unusually good at systematic observation. The combination of academic backgrounds, genuine intellectual curiosity, and the discipline that long-form satire imposes the requirement that the exaggeration be grounded in something real enough to be funny, rather than simply random, produced a writing room that was reading the present more carefully than most journalists and most academics were reading it. When the show depicted a Trump presidency in the year 2000, it was not predicting the future. It was observing a specific trajectory, the convergence of celebrity culture and political culture that had been visible and accelerating for decades, and following that trajectory to its logical conclusion. The writers were not surprised when the conclusion arrived 16 years later. They had already been to where it was going. This is the mechanism, not prophecy. The careful following of visible trajectories to conclusions that are, once you have followed them that far, obvious, but that most people are not positioned to follow because most people are not in the business of systematically observing where things are going and then animating the destination. The prediction episodes are the episodes where the show was most honest about what it was seeing. The banned episodes are the episodes where what the show was seeing was something that someone with power over the content preferred not to have seen. Both categories are the result of the same quality: the willingness to follow what is real to where it is going, regardless of where it ends up. The Brazil episode saw the trajectory of American popular culture's representation of Latin America and followed it to its logical conclusion. The conclusion generated a diplomatic incident because it was accurate enough to cause damage. Homer's phobia saw the trajectory of American homophobia's specific, domestic form and followed it to its honest portrait. The network tried to kill the portrait because it was accurate enough to be uncomfortable. The New York episode saw the trajectory of the city's relationship to its own landmarks and made a comedy out of the permanence and the scale of the towers. And the tragedy of September 11th destroyed the comedy's premise by removing the premise from the world. All of the best episodes, banned or not, are the ones where the following was done most honestly. All of the bans are the moments where the honesty arrived somewhere inconvenient. The show that sees clearly is the show that generates both the predictions and the bans. The seeing is the same quality in both cases. The difference is whether what is seen is something that the people with power over the content want to have said out loud. Expanded Section 9, Continuation Behind the Laughter. The episode that almost knew too much. The version of Behind the Laughter that almost got made is, in some ways, more interesting than the version that did. Not because the version that did get made is bad, it isn't. It is sharp and funny, and the VH1 parody is executed with real precision. But because the version that was being made before the notes process modified, it was trying to do something that very few pieces of television entertainment ever attempt: to use the format of confessional documentary to say honest things about its own institutional context. What was removed from Behind the Laughter before it aired was not simply a few pointed jokes about the network. It was the episode's ambition to be genuinely honest about the conditions under which the show was made. The show had, by the end of season 11, been in production for over a decade. In that decade, there had been real contract disputes, real salary negotiations, real tensions between the creative team and the institutional infrastructure they were embedded in. There had been moments when the show's relationship with Fox was openly contentious. There had been moments when specific writers and producers had publicly discussed the difficulty of maintaining creative integrity within a network television production context. All of that history was material that the episode could have used. The confessional documentary format invited that material. A genuine behind the music about The Simpsons would have included the behind-the-scenes conflict, the same way that real behind-the-music episodes included the infighting and the business disputes and the power struggles that were as much a part of those bands' stories as the music itself. The version of Behind the Laughter that almost got made was closer to that genuine confessional. It was reaching toward the honest version of the show's own story, including the parts of that story that the institution that produced it would have preferred not to have documented. The version that got made pulled back from that reach at the specific points where the reach would have produced real friction with real people who had real power over the show's continued existence. The result is an episode that is reaching throughout its entire running time, and then, at each moment where the reaching would land on something true and specific and potentially painful for someone in a powerful position, finding somewhere else to put its hand. This kind of modification is almost impossible to see from outside the production process. You would have to know what the episode was trying to say to see where it stopped saying it. The episode that aired looks complete. It does not look like something with pieces missing. It looks like a well-executed parody of a documentary format, with the emotional beats landing where they were designed to land, with the jokes working at the level they were designed to work at. But the people who made it know what it was trying to be. They know where the modifications were made and what was there before the modifications arrived. They know the gap between the episode they were writing and the episode they were allowed to make. That gap is the most common form of content suppression in the show's history and in television history generally. Not the dramatic removal of a completed episode from the broadcast schedule, but the quiet modification of an episode in development the notes process shaping the content before it can arrive, in a form that would create problems for the people who control the show's distribution. The notes process is not malicious. The people delivering the notes are not villains. They are making institutional calculations about risk and liability and the maintenance of relationships that the show depends on for its continued existence. The notes are reasonable from within the logic of institutional self-preservation, but the notes cost something every time they are accepted. They cost the specific truth that was going to be said before the notes arrived and changed what was being said. Accumulated across 3.5 decades of production, the accepted notes represent a significant amount of material that was reaching toward honesty and was redirected towards something more institutionally acceptable. Behind the Laughter is the clearest single example of this in the show's history, because it is the episode where the subject of the episode, the show's own experience of being made, was exactly the subject that the notes process was most invested in managing. The subject of the show and the mechanism of suppression were, in this specific case, the same thing. The episode was trying to say what was true about how the show was made, and the mechanism that prevented it from saying everything was the mechanism of how the show was made. There is something elegantly terrible about that. The show reached for its own truth, and the hand that stopped the reaching was part of the truth it was reaching for. Expanded Section 10 Continuation. The Apu Situation. How culture catches up to comedy. The thing about the Apu situation that makes it different from most of the content controversies in the show's history is that it did not arrive from outside. It arrived from within the community that had been consuming the show. Every other controversy we've discussed tonight came from outside the show's primary audience. Foreign governments, networks, legal departments, the grief of a city, the distant echo of a documentary about a different subject. The Apu controversy came from American viewers, South Asian American viewers specifically, who had been watching the show for years and whose experience of watching it included the specific experience of watching a caricature of their own community presented as harmless comedy to an enormous audience. The harm Kondabolu documented was not the harm of having your feelings hurt by an unflattering representation. It was the harm of a representation having real effects in the real world, the effects that accumulate when you grow up in a country where one of the most widely seen images of people who look like you is a heavily accented caricature that functions primarily as a source of comedy for people who don't look like you. The effects are well documented in the testimony of the people Kondabolu interviewed. The accent deployed as mockery in schoolyards and workplaces. The reduction of a complex cultural identity to a set of comedy conventions associated with a fictional convenience store owner. The sense of existing, in the eyes of the mainstream culture, primarily as a punchline. These are not abstract harms. They are the specific, material harms that come from being stereotyped in mass media in ways that other people absorb and reproduce. They are the harms that the creators of the character did not intend and did not anticipate because the creators were not members of the community being stereotyped and were therefore not positioned to see the harm from the inside. The question of what the show should do with this is genuinely hard. It is hard in the specific way that most questions about historical harm are hard. The harm is real and documented, and the people who were harmed deserve acknowledgement and accounting. And yet the available responses to the harm are all imperfect in different ways. Removing the episodes that feature Apu would distort the historical record of the show. The episodes are part of what the show was, and erasing them would erase not just the harm but the evidence of the harm, making it harder for future audiences to understand what happened and why it mattered. This is the argument against the erasure approach to historical content that caused harm. The harm is better documented than hidden. Keeping the episodes exactly as they are, without any additional context or acknowledgement, treats the harm as if it did not happen, which is its own kind of erasure. The episodes are available and will continue to be found by new audiences, and without any indication that the character and its performance became the subject of a serious cultural controversy, those new audiences will receive the character without the context that would allow them to engage with it thoughtfully. The show's actual response, largely writing the character out of new episodes, making the voice casting change without much public ceremony, producing the metatextual episode that the audience mostly experienced as a shrug, fell between these two options in a way that satisfied neither of them. It acknowledged the problem without addressing it, and without providing the kind of honest engagement with the harm that would have made the acknowledgement meaningful. Hank Azaria's separate and more thorough reckoning is the more honest version of what a response could look like. Azaria engaged with the community. He apologized specifically. He tried to understand the harm from the perspective of the people who experienced it. He did not simply remove himself from the situation and move on. He stayed in it and tried to account for it as thoroughly as he was capable of accounting for it. That kind of accounting is hard. It requires sitting with the discomfort of having participated in something harmful without understanding its harmfulness, which is one of the more uncomfortable positions a person can occupy, because the lack of malicious intent does not undo the harm and the acknowledgement of the harm does not undo the lack of malicious intent. Both things are true simultaneously. You did not mean to cause harm. You caused harm. Both of these things are true, and they do not cancel each other out, and you have to live with both of them at once. The Apu situation is ongoing partly because that sitting with has not been completed by the institution that produced the character. The show has moved past Apu. He appears rarely now. His role has been diminished, but the show has not sat with the harm in the way that would constitute genuine accounting. It has managed the situation rather than engaging with it. The management is, in its way, its own kind of invisible edit. The content has been changed, but the change has not been accompanied by the acknowledgement that would make the change meaningful. The history of the character remains in the archive. The harm it caused remains in the testimony of the people who experienced it. The gap between the history and the testimony is where the accounting should have happened and mostly didn't. Expanded section. 11 continuation. The Treehouse of Horror and the Limits of Genre Permission. The Treehouse of Horror specials occupy a unique position in the show's content history because they are the part of the show that operates under explicit genre permissions that the main narrative does not have. The Halloween framing is not just a thematic choice. It is a formal declaration that the rules are different for these episodes, that the content will push past the boundaries of the show's regular register, and that the audience is invited to engage with that pushing as a feature rather than a deviation. This explicit permission structure is what makes the special's relationship to broadcast standards so interesting. The main narrative generates broadcast restrictions through content that pushed past the network's comfort zone despite operating within the show's regular register. The specials generate broadcast restrictions through content that pushed past external broadcasting standards while operating within the genre permissions that the show had explicitly granted itself. In other words, the main narrative was restricted when it exceeded what the show was supposed to do. The specials were restricted when they did exactly what the show said they were going to do. The genre permissions that Halloween horror allows violence that results in death, imagery that is genuinely scary rather than simply cartoonish, supernatural content with actual theological weight are permissions that American broadcasting culture has historically been more comfortable granting than the permissions that sexual content requires. Horror is a legitimate mass-market entertainment genre with a long history in American culture. Violence and death are part of that genre's formal vocabulary, and the vocabulary is generally accepted as appropriate for adult audiences and carefully managed for family hour contexts. The specials navigated this by being explicit about their generic identity. The Treehouse of Horror framing tells the audience, this is horror. The rules of horror apply. The content will be darker and stranger and more viscerally intense than what the regular episodes contain. The framing worked well enough in the American market that the specials were able to push considerably further in their content than the main narrative ever went, and the pushing was generally accepted within the genre framework. In international markets, the genre framework functioned differently. The specific permissions that American broadcasting culture extends to horror as a mainstream entertainment genre are not universal. In markets where horror as a genre has a different cultural status, or where the specific content that horror permits runs harder against broadcast standards than the show's genre declaration can protect, the specials required intervention. The specific form of the intervention varied. Time shifting was common, moving the specials to later night slots where adult content standards applied rather than family hour standards. Content advisories were applied in some markets. In others, specific segments were shortened or removed. The intervention was almost always applied at the moments where the specials were doing most explicitly what horror does, depicting death with more specificity than the main narrative would permit, engaging with supernatural imagery with a directness that the main narrative's more grounded register avoided, or finding comedy in the extremity of violence in ways that required the violence to be genuinely extreme rather than merely suggested. The segments that generated the most intervention were the ones that went furthest in these directions. The deaths that were depicted with enough specificity to be viscerally disturbing rather than simply conceptually disturbing, the supernatural imagery that was specific enough in its theological references to generate concerns in religiously sensitive markets, and the extreme violent sequences that went past the threshold where the comedy horror genre permission protected them, and into territory where they required active content management. What the special's broadcast history reveals is a consistent picture of the show's content architecture. The main narrative operated within a zone of content that most markets could handle without modification. The specials operated outside that zone, deliberately, as part of their generic identity. The international modifications to the specials are the map of where that zone's edges were in different cultural and regulatory contexts. The map is interesting because it is different in different places. The edge that matters for a UK pre-watershed broadcaster is different from the edge that matters for a Middle Eastern broadcaster, which is different from the edge that matters for an Australian broadcaster. The specials generated different kinds of modifications in different markets because the specials were reaching past the edge in multiple directions simultaneously, and each market's specific edge was in a different place relative to the content. The consistent factor across all of the modifications is that they were applied to the moments where the specials were doing most exactly what they were designed to do, being genuinely, specifically horror, rather than being the show's regular comedy with a Halloween costume on. The modifications were applied when the genre permission ran out, when the humor could not protect the horror from the standards that the broadcasting context required, when the specific darkness the specials were reaching for exceeded what the specific market could accept. Expanded Section 12 continuation. The final loop. What it all means. There is a moment at the end of every Simpsons episode where the family is on the couch gag has played, usually at the beginning, but by the end of the episode, the family is always back where they started, together, in the house on Evergreen Terrace, with the television on. The specific catastrophe the episode has put them through has been resolved, or has been left unresolved in a way that the next episode will ignore entirely, and the family is back in the position they are always in at the end of a Simpsons episode, together, at home, still themselves. This is the show's fundamental promise. Whatever happens, the family survives it. Whatever goes wrong, the family comes back to the couch, the loop holds. The ending is always the same. The family is there, the house is there, Springfield is there, and everything that the episode did to all of them has not ultimately broken any of it. The banned episodes are, in the context of this promise, interesting because they represent the moments when the promise was tested most severely. Not within the show's narrative. The show's narrative has always been protected from permanent consequences by the reset that every episode ends with. But around the show's narrative, the moments when the forces outside the show tried to change what the show was allowed to say, or to remove a piece of the show from the accessible record, or to modify what the show contained so that what it said was something more acceptable and something less true. The loop held in most cases. The show survived all of its bans and all of its controversies and all of the modifications the notes process imposed on it and all of the diplomatic incidents that erupted around it. The show is still on the air. The family is still on the couch. The couch gag still plays. But the episodes that were removed are not on the couch with the family. Stark Raving Dad is not on the streaming service. The City of New York episode was absent from the schedule for years. Homer's Phobia nearly never made it to the air. The Apu episodes are in the catalog, but their presence there is now complicated by the history of what they were and what they did. These absences are the evidence of the testing. They are the marks that the external forces left on the show's body. The show survived the testing, but the survival was not clean. The show that survived is not the show that was made. It is the show after the testing, which is not the same thing. What we can do, sitting in the dark with these stories, is remember what was there before the testing and what the testing took away. Not out of nostalgia and not out of any simple judgment that the testing was wrong. Some of it was wrong and some of it was, in its specific circumstances, the most humane available response to a difficult situation. But out of the recognition that understanding what was there tells you something about the show that watching the show as it currently exists cannot fully tell you. The shadow archive of the banned episodes is the show's most honest document. It is the record of what the show was reaching for before the reaching was redirected or interrupted. It is the evidence of the show's ambition at its most unguarded, before the institutional forces that shape all long-running television productions had fully finished processing what the show was trying to be. Homer still drives home. The family still makes it to the couch. Springfield is still there, impossible and persistent, organized around its own impossible reality the way all places we love are organized around the impossible things we need them to be. But somewhere in the archive, Leon Kompowski walks down a street at the end of an episode that has been removed from the standard catalog, and the twins stand over Lower Manhattan in a comedy that was too painful to look at for years. And John, the antique dealer, deals patiently with a man's discomfort in an episode that almost never existed. And Armin Tamzarian pretends to be Seymour Skinner, and the town votes to keep the lie, and the real Skinner is expelled, and the judge makes it illegal to remember. The thing that stays with me, at the end of all of this, is that last image. The real Seymour Skinner, the man who told the truth, expelled from the community that preferred the comfortable version. Not because the truth was wrong, not because the truth was harmful, but because the truth was inconvenient and the lie was settled, and the community had built its life around the lie and could not afford to rebuild around the truth. That is Springfield. That is the show's most honest statement about itself and about the communities it depicts, and possibly about all communities. The truth is always available, always there, always ready to be found by anyone who goes looking. And the community always has the option to expel the truth and make the lie official and build a law around the forgetting. The banned episodes are the real Seymour Skinners of the show's history. They are there, outside the city limits, waiting for the community to decide whether it wants to let them back in. Some of them have come back. Some of them are still waiting. Springfield is still there. The loop keeps running. Extended deep dive. The mechanics of the Stark Raving Dad production. There are things about how Stark Raving Dad was actually made, the specific logistics of getting Michael Jackson into a recording booth, the specific decisions the writers made about how to use his voice, the specific conversations that happened between the production and the network about what they were doing that have never been fully documented in any single source, and that the passing of time and the episode's removal from the catalog have made increasingly difficult to assemble from the scattered interviews and commentaries where pieces of the story exist. What is documented comes primarily from DVD commentary tracks, from interviews that the show's writers and producers gave in the 1990s and early 2000s when the episode was still a celebrated part of the catalog, and from the more recent statements made when the episode was removed. The picture that emerges from these sources is of a production that understood exactly what it was doing at every stage and that made deliberate, careful choices about how to manage the collaboration. The decision to credit Jackson as John J. Smith was not the only option available. The show could simply have credited him under his own name and turned his participation into a promotional event. Jackson's name above the title of a Simpsons episode would have been a significant moment in both careers in 1991, a piece of cross-promotional magic that the network would almost certainly have preferred. The show chose not to do this, and the choice was not accidental. Not crediting Jackson by name was a way of controlling what the collaboration meant. If Jackson appeared under his own name, the episode became about Michael Jackson, about his specific celebrity, about the specific thing it meant for the most famous person in the world to guest on an animated sitcom, about the public relationship between Jackson and the show. By using the pseudonym and maintaining the fiction that the voice was performed by a character actor named John J. Smith, the production protected something they apparently considered worth protecting: the episode's ability to be about its characters rather than about the celebrity of its guest. This is an unusual creative instinct. Most episodes that secured celebrity guests at this level of fame were very happy to make the celebrity the point of the episode, to organize the narrative around the guest's celebrity identity, to give the audience what the audience presumably came to see. The show did this too with many guests. But the Jackson collaboration was handled differently, and the different handling reveals something about what the production valued. What they valued was the emotion of the birthday song scene and the humanity of the Leon Kompowski character. They understood that both of these things required the audience to engage with the character as a character rather than as a celebrity cameo. If the audience knew they were watching Michael Jackson perform, the birthday song scene would be processed through the frame of Michael Jackson performing as a spectacular moment, as a celebrity event, as something thrilling for its extravagance. Processed through the John J. Smith frame, the audience could receive it as what it was designed to be, a gentle, simple thing, slightly clumsy, made beautiful not by its professionalism but by its sincerity. The production protected the sincerity by protecting the pseudonym. The open secret was the price of the protection. Everyone knew eventually, but the knowing came after the watching, which meant the watching could happen clean. Jackson's own understanding of this choice, why he agreed to it, what it meant to him to perform under a pseudonym for a cartoon, is not fully documented anywhere. But the performance itself suggests an understanding. He played Leon with a quality that was the opposite of his public persona's extravagance. There is no showmanship in the voice work. There is no moment where the performance reaches for effect. There is just the warmth and gentleness and generosity that the character required, delivered with complete restraint and complete sincerity. That restraint is extraordinary in context. This is Michael Jackson, who built his career partly on spectacle, partly on the extraordinary, partly on being visually and sonically impossible to ignore. In the booth for this episode, he made himself entirely subordinate to the scene. The voice is the character's voice, not Jackson's voice doing a character. The technique disappeared into the service of the role. Whatever else is true about Michael Jackson, that performance is real and remarkable. The discipline of it, the quietness of it, the absolute commitment to making the scene work on its own terms rather than on the terms of who was performing it. This is the thing that makes the episode's removal such a specific and complicated loss. What was there was genuinely beautiful. The beauty came from a collaboration between the show's creative team and a performer who contributed something specific and irreplaceable to it. The removal of the episode from the accessible record is the removal of that beauty from the places where it could be stumbled across and discovered. It still exists, but it no longer occupies the space in the show's catalog, where beautiful episodes live. The specificity of the loss matters because it is easy to discuss the removal in abstract terms, the impossible ethical situation, the competing claims, the imperfect available options without sitting with what was actually taken away and what the taking away costs. What was taken away was a birthday song performed with extraordinary care for an 8-year-old cartoon girl who needed to feel seen. What the taking away costs is the continued easy availability of that specific, irreplaceable expression of care. That is the loss. It is not nothing. Extended Deep Dive. September 11th and the specific nature of image grief. One of the things that the September 11th removal of the city of New York versus Homer Simpson illuminates is the specific way that grief relates to visual imagery, which is different from how grief relates to ideas or to verbal description. Grief does not operate uniformly across all modes of representation. A verbal account of a loss, a description, an explanation, a narrative is processed by the grieving mind differently from a visual image of what was lost. The verbal account requires active engagement, the construction of mental imagery, the translation of words into pictures. The visual image bypasses that process. It delivers the thing directly to the visual cortex, which processes it before the analytical mind has had time to prepare a response. This difference is why certain images become sites of grief in ways that verbal descriptions of the same events do not. The famous photographs from September 11th, the towers on fire, the people running, the specific images from that day that were broadcast and rebroadcast until they became the shared visual vocabulary of the event, became difficult to look at in ways that verbal accounts of the same events did not, precisely because the images arrived directly, without the mediation that verbal processing provides. The Simpsons episode created a specific version of this problem. It was not a documentary or a news broadcast. It was a comedy. The images of the towers it contained were not images of the towers in distress. They were images of the towers as they normally looked, solid and enormous and permanent, with Homer's car parked in the gap between them and Homer's frustration with the parking situation organized around their presence. This normalcy was, in September 2001, the specific quality that made the images unbearable. The towers in the episode were not the towers of September 11th. They were the towers of September 10th. They were there the way they always were, the way they had always been, the way they were supposed to keep being, and the fact that they were there in exactly the way they were supposed to keep being was the thing that was impossible to look at without the looking-producing grief. There is a specific form of visual grief that comes from images of places and things as they were before the catastrophe. This is the grief of the before picture, the photograph of the house before the fire, the photograph of the family before the loss, the photograph of the person before the illness. These images do not depict the catastrophe, they depict the absence of the catastrophe. And the absence of the catastrophe in the image, held against the knowledge of the catastrophe's eventual arrival, is one of the most particular forms of pain that visual imagery can produce. The Simpsons episode was, in September 2001, a continuous series of these before pictures. Every shot of the towers, every establishing shot of Lower Manhattan, every moment when Homer or Marge or the children looked up at the skyline was a before picture, an image of the world, as it had been 2 weeks earlier, held against the knowledge of what had happened to it. The before picture is more painful, in many cases, than the after picture. The after picture shows you the damage. The damage is hard to look at, but it is honest. It shows you what is. The before picture shows you what was, and the gap between what was and what is has to be felt across by the viewer in a way that the after picture does not require. The before picture asks you to hold both things in your mind simultaneously, the normalcy of the image and the knowledge of its loss. That simultaneous holding is the specific form of pain that made the Simpsons episode impossible to broadcast. Understanding this helps clarify why the episode could eventually return to circulation. The mechanism that made it painful was the specific quality of the September 2001 grief, the acute phase, where the loss was so recent and so total that any image of what was lost produced an overwhelming response. As the grief became integrated into the ongoing texture of American life, as September 11th became history rather than immediate present, as the before pictures became documents of a historical moment rather than wounds in the present tense, the mechanism changed. The episode can be watched now because the before pictures can be held now without the holding being overwhelming. The towers are still lost, the grief is still real. But the grief has become the kind of grief that is part of life, rather than the kind of grief that consumes all available experience. The before picture is still a before picture, but the pain of the gap between before and after has become manageable in a way it was not manageable in 2001. This is the specific arc of the episode's removal and return, and it is worth understanding it in these terms rather than in the simpler terms of content acceptability. The episode was not pulled because it was wrong or harmful. It was pulled because the specific quality of its imagery was, in the specific moment of its pulling, more than the culture could hold. And it was returned when the culture had developed enough capacity to hold it. Extended Deep Dive. The Homer's Phobia Writer's Room Fight in Historical Context. The fight over Homer's phobia did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in 1996 and 1997. Which is a specific moment in American cultural and political history that shaped the nature of the fight and determined what was at stake in it. 1996 is the year that the Defense of Marriage Act was signed into law by President Clinton, formally defining marriage in federal law as a union between a man and a woman and allowing states to refuse to recognize same-sex marriages performed in other states. It is the year that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was in its 3rd year of operation, the policy that allowed gay people to serve in the military only if they did not disclose their sexual orientation. It is the year that the religious right was at or near the peak of its political influence in the Republican Party and was organizing significant political pressure around the question of gay rights in ways that made the subject genuinely politically explosive. American primetime television in 1996 was deeply nervous about gay content in ways that reflected this political context. Ellen DeGeneres' coming out episode, which would air in April 1997, was being discussed in advance as a potentially career-ending move. Will and Grace, which would become one of the most significant gay-friendly shows in television history, would not premiere until 1998. The network television landscape in 1996 was one in which gay characters existed primarily as minor figures, often comedic sidekicks, defined almost entirely by their sexuality as a joke rather than as a dimension of a full person. The Fox network's discomfort with Homer's phobia was not an isolated institutional quirk. It reflected the broader political and cultural context in which a primetime entertainment show airing in family hours was an extremely exposed position from which to engage seriously and sympathetically with gay characters. The advertiser concerns were real. The FCC concerns, while less specific, were background noise in the political climate of 1996. The possibility of a viewer or political group campaign against the episode was not abstract. In this context, the show's decision to make the episode and to fight for it against the network's resistance was a more significant act of creative and institutional courage than it might appear from the safer perspective of nearly 30 years. Later, the writers were not simply pushing back against a single note in a single note session. They were choosing to engage with a subject that the institutional environment around them was highly motivated to avoid, and they were doing it in a way that was specifically designed not to allow the subject to be avoided, that made Homer's homophobia the point rather than a background fact, that made the gay character fully human rather than a safe comedic accessory. The decision to cast John Waters was part of this refusal to allow the subject to be softened. Waters was not a safe choice. Waters had spent his career being extremely visible about his sexuality in the specific way that Hollywood had been most anxious about. Not closeted, not managing the subject carefully, but flagrantly, joyfully, completely himself about it in ways that made the mainstream deeply uncomfortable. Casting Waters as John was a choice that put the show's commitment on the table. This is what we mean when we say gay character. We mean a person like John Waters. We mean someone specific and real and fully himself. We are not giving you a coded presence. We are giving you the actual thing. The network's discomfort with this, read in its historical context, is comprehensible. The network was making a reasonable institutional calculation about risk in a specific political climate. The show's resistance to that calculation was the creative team making a different calculation. That the episode was important enough to be worth the risk, and that making it safely would be making it badly, and making it badly would be a betrayal of the subject and the audience. That calculation turned out to be correct. The Emmy win came in 1997, the same year Ellen DeGeneres came out, the same year Will and Grace began development, a year before Newsweek magazine would run a cover story about how gay characters had invaded American television. Homer's phobia was part of a cultural moment that the show understood before the moment had fully arrived. This is the show at its predictive best, not predicting the future through any supernatural mechanism, but reading the present accurately enough to see where it was going and arriving at the destination ahead of schedule. Extended deep dive. The Apu situation and what institutional responses reveal. The contrast between Hank Azaria's personal response to the Apu controversy and the show's institutional response is worth sitting with at length, because the contrast illuminates something important about the difference between genuine reckoning and managed damage control. Azaria's engagement with the South Asian American community after Kondabolu's documentary was unusual in its specificity and its duration. It was not a single press release. It was an ongoing process that involved actual meetings with actual people, actual apologies that were specific about what the apology was for, actual engagement with the testimony of people whose experience of the harm was very different from his experience of producing it. What Azaria was engaging with, through this process, was the specific epistemological challenge that comes from discovering that something you did while believing it was harmless was causing harm you could not see. This challenge is particularly difficult because it requires holding two things simultaneously: the knowledge that you did not intend harm, and the knowledge that the harm happened regardless of your intention. The lack of malicious intent is real. It does not cancel the harm. Both things are true, and the question of how to respond to both things being true at once is genuinely difficult. The easy response is to prioritize the lack of malicious intent. To say, "I did not mean to harm anyone, therefore the accusation of harm is unfair, therefore I need not engage with it further." This is the response that defends the self by refusing to see the harm. It is the response that allows the person to be comfortable at the cost of understanding. The harder response is what Azaria undertook: to hold both things at the same time, to acknowledge the lack of intent and the presence of harm as simultaneously true, to engage with the testimony of the people who were harmed in the specific ways they were harmed, and to let that engagement change your understanding of what you were participating in. This response is uncomfortable. It does not allow you to be comfortable at the cost of understanding. It requires you to be uncomfortable in proportion to the depth of the understanding. The show's institutional response did not engage at this depth. The metatextual episode was managed discomfort, an acknowledgement that the conversation was happening, performed in a way that maintained the show's authority over its own narrative, while not truly engaging with the harm that had been documented. The episode said, "We know there is a conversation. We are uncertain how to engage with it." And then it declined to engage with it and moved on. The difference between these two responses is the difference between the institution and the individual. Institutions make managed responses. They have lawyers and public relations departments and stakeholder considerations that shape what they can say and how they can say it. Individuals can make unmanaged responses. They can sit with the discomfort without having to produce a statement that satisfies all of the institution's competing interests. Azaria, acting as an individual rather than as a representative of the institutional Simpsons, was able to engage with the Apu situation in a way that the institution could not or would not. His engagement was more honest and more useful and more likely to produce actual understanding than the institution's engagement. But his engagement also did not change the catalog, did not alter the episodes that had been made, did not produce anything that addressed the harm at the structural level where the harm was produced. This is the limitation of individual reckoning in the face of institutional harm. One person engaging honestly and thoroughly with their part in something does not address the institutional infrastructure that produced the thing. The Apu character was not created by Hank Azaria alone. He was created by writers and producers and network executives and the entire ecosystem of decisions and non-decisions that produced a show in which the Indian immigrant convenience store owner was voiced by a white actor performing an accent, and this was not understood as a significant problem for decades. Azaria's reckoning addresses his part. The institutional reckoning that would address the rest has not happened. The catalog is still there, with the episodes, with the accent, with the decades of representation that the documentary documented as harmful. The institutional response managed the controversy. It did not reckon with the harm. The gap between managing and reckoning is, in many ways, the gap that the entire history of the show's banned and controversial episodes lives in. The episodes that generated the most significant responses, Homer's phobia, Stark raving dad, the Apu situation, generated managed responses from the institution and genuine reckonings where they happened at all, from the individuals involved. The managed responses protected the institution. The genuine reckonings changed people. The show that produced all of it is still on the air. The family is still on the couch. Springfield is still there. The things that were taken away are still taken away. The things that were modified are still modified. The harm that was done is still documented. The loop holds. The family persists. The archive keeps everything, even the things that the people who made it would prefer the archive not to keep. That is the show's real legacy, in the end. Not the couch gag, not the guest stars, not the predictions. The fact that it ran long enough to accumulate a history that contains all of this, the brilliance and the harm and the fights for honesty and the institutional retreats from honesty and the removed episodes and the modified episodes, and the ongoing reckoning with what was made and what the making cost, and that the history is available to anyone who goes looking for it. We went looking tonight, we found what was there. Some of it is difficult to hold, and some of it is beautiful, and some of it is both at once. That is what the archive contains. That is what Springfield keeps. Extended Deep Dive. The network notes ecosystem, how restrictions happen without anyone deciding they should. The notes process that almost killed Homer's phobia is, in its normal operation, nearly invisible. It does not generate press releases. It does not produce documentable moments of decision. It happens in meetings, and on phone calls, and in written documents that circulate within the production infrastructure and are not preserved in any publicly accessible record. The history of what the notes process has done to The Simpsons across its entire run is therefore largely unrecoverable from the outside. What survives in accessible form are the moments where the fight was big enough that the people involved talked about it afterward in interviews and commentary tracks and retrospective accounts that let pieces of the process become visible long after they happened. Homer's phobia is the most documented case because it was the biggest fight, and because the outcome the Emmy win, the episode's subsequent reputation gave the people who fought it reasons to talk about having fought it. But it was not the only fight. Across 35 seasons, there were dozens of other battles between the show's creative team and the institutional oversight mechanisms around them, many of which left no public record and produced outcomes that are visible only in their effects on what the show ultimately said. The notes process works through a specific institutional logic that is worth understanding in its own terms, because understanding it helps explain both why it produces the outcomes it produces and why those outcomes are so difficult to document or to challenge. The logic is risk management. The network and studio that produce a television show are financial institutions with financial interests in the show's continued operation. The show generates revenue through advertising sales, syndication deals, streaming licensing, and merchandise. Every piece of content in every episode is, from the institutional perspective, a potential source of risk to these revenue streams. The risk of advertiser flight, the risk of regulatory action, the risk of public controversy that damages the show's brand value, the risk of legal action from parties who believe the content harms them. The notes process exists to identify and manage these risks before the content airs. The notes identify specific moments in specific episodes that the institutional assessment determines carry elevated risk, and they express preferences for modifications that would reduce the risk. The modifications are framed as suggestions rather than mandates. Because the creative team has its own institutional standing, the show's ratings and cultural cachet give it leverage, and the notes process operates as a negotiation rather than as a one-way imposition. But the negotiation is not between equal parties. The network controls the broadcast, the creative team controls the creative product. The network can decline to broadcast the creative product if it determines that the product's risks outweigh its benefits. The creative team can decline to make modifications that it believes would damage the product. The resolution of any specific conflict depends on the relative strength of each party's position in the specific circumstances of that conflict. What this means in practice is that the notes process systematically produces content modifications in the direction of reduced risk, not in the direction of reduced quality or increased honesty. The modifications are not designed to make the show worse. They are designed to make the show safer. Whether making the show safer also makes it worse is a separate question, and the answer to that question varies by specific case. In the case of Homer's phobia, making the show safer would have made it significantly worse, because the specific qualities that made the episode excellent television were also the qualities that elevated its risk profile. The honest portrayal of Homer's homophobia was risky because it was honest. The gay character's full humanity was risky because it was full. The episode's refusal to treat the subject as something to be handled carefully from a safe distance was risky because it refused the safety. Each of these qualities was both what made the episode good and what made the network nervous about it. The show's team held the line on all of them, but the holding was hard and took months and required the creative team to expend significant political capital in the institutional relationship with the network, capital that was not available in unlimited supply. This is the less visible cost of the notes process, not just the modifications it produces, but the political capital required to prevent the modifications it would otherwise produce. Every fight that the creative team wins costs something in the ongoing relationship with the network. Winning too many fights too often is not sustainable. The team has to choose its battles, which means there are battles it does not choose, which means there are modifications it accepts that it might have fought in different circumstances. The cumulative effect of this across 35 seasons, the battles fought and won, the battles not fought, the modifications accepted as the cost of the battles fought and won, the modifications imposed when the political capital for resistance was not available, is the gap between the show that was being made and the show that exists. That gap is the notes process made visible, and it is enormous, and most of it is permanently invisible because it lives in the meeting rooms and phone calls and draft scripts that have no public record. Homer's phobia is the exception. The fight was big enough, the outcome was celebrated enough, and the people involved were willing enough to talk about it that the fight became part of the episode's documented history. It lets us see, through one specific case, the general mechanism that has been operating continuously and largely invisibly throughout the show's entire production. Extended deep dive. The role of fan communities in preserving what gets banned. One of the most interesting phenomena in the history of banned Simpsons content is the role that fan communities have played in preserving and documenting the things that official channels have tried to reduce in accessibility or to remove entirely. The fan community for The Simpsons is one of the oldest, largest, and most persistently active in American television history. Alt TV. Simpsons, the Usenet news group that became one of the earliest organized fan communities for any television show, was active from the show's earliest seasons and developed into a hub for the kind of detailed, analytical, episode-by-episode engagement with the show's content that was unusual in fan communities of that era. The community that grew from it produced the early episode guides, the continuity databases, the catalog of inside references and external allusions that the show embedded in its content, and the accumulated knowledge of the show's history that has been refined and expanded ever since. When content is removed or modified, fan communities are usually the first to notice and the first to document. They notice because they know the original content well enough to see when something is missing. They document because the impulse that drives serious fan engagement, the impulse to know the show completely, to have the full picture, to understand what the thing is and what it was, and how it got from one to the other, is not satisfied by the official record when the official record has been modified or reduced. In the case of Stark Raving Dad, the fan community's response to the episode's removal was to ensure that the episode remained accessible through channels that the official removal could not reach. Fan sites hosted the episode. Archival communities preserved it. The episode's removal from official channels was, in practical terms, a reduction in its accessibility rather than an elimination of it, and the fan community's preservation activity was the mechanism by which even the reduced accessibility was maintained against further reduction. This is the cultural function that unofficial preservation performs. It ensures that the official record is not the only record, that the things the institution prefers not to foreground remain available to the people who want to find them, that the modifications and removals and suppressions that the official record enacts are not the end of the story. The fan community's preservation of Stark Raving Dad is not legally endorsed. Distributing copyrighted content without authorization raises genuine legal questions. The rights to the episode are owned by the production company that made it, and the production company has made a decision about the episode's distribution, and the fan preservation activity operates in defiance of that decision. But the cultural function of the preservation is not illegal. The function is the maintenance of a record, the maintenance of the evidence that the thing was there, that it was good, that it was the first episode of Season 3 of The Simpsons, that it featured the voice of Michael Jackson, and it was about a birthday song, and it was about what parents and siblings owe each other in the way of being seen. The fan communities that preserve this are not doing something simple. They are doing something that has a specific cultural value. They are refusing to let the official record be the whole story. They are insisting that what existed before the removal was removed is part of the history of the thing, not just the residue after the removal. This insistence has its own relationship to the show's themes. The Simpsons has always been interested in the mechanisms by which communities decide what to remember and what to forget, what to make official and what to leave unofficial, whose version of events gets to be the version that counts. The fan community preserving Stark Raving Dad is behaving in the opposite way from the town that expelled the real Seymour Skinner. The town chose the comfortable version. The fan community is refusing the comfortable version. The fan community is being Lisa Simpson, the person who asks the inconvenient questions and refuses to accept the official story when the official story is not the whole story. That is the deepest form of engagement with a show, about the gap between official versions and real versions. To watch it, to love it, to know it well enough, to notice when something is missing, and to keep the missing thing accessible, this is participation in the show's own project, carried out at the level of the relationship between the fan and the thing they love. Extended deep dive, the floating timeline, the bands, and what both reveal about desire. The show's most consistent and fundamental formal device is the floating timeline, the decision to set each episode in the present tense of whenever it airs, to never let the characters age, to treat continuity as something to be drawn on selectively, rather than maintained rigorously. This device is what allows a show to run for 35 years without having to deal with what it would mean for Bart Simpson to grow up. The floating timeline is usually discussed as a formal convenience. It lets the show keep making episodes without being constrained by the accumulation of past events. It keeps the characters at the ages where they are most dramatically useful. It allows the show to be eternally contemporary without having to resolve the contradictions that would arise if 35 years of story had to be held in continuity. All of this is true, and all of it is insufficient, because the floating timeline is also a statement about what the show believes the audience wants, or, more precisely, about what the show believes the audience needs. The show does not age its characters because aging would require the show to acknowledge that time passes, and the acknowledgement that time passes would require the show to acknowledge that things end. That Bart eventually becomes an adult, that Homer eventually retires, that Maggie eventually speaks, that the house on Evergreen Terrace eventually becomes somewhere the family used to live, that the family eventually becomes people who used to live together. The show does not want to tell this story, not because the story would be bad. The flash-forward episodes that have imagined this story suggest it could be extraordinary, but because telling the story would mean ending the version of the story the audience most wants, the version where the family is always together, always young enough to be in the same house, always there when you tune in on Sunday night. The floating timeline is a permanent present tense maintained by a collective agreement not to acknowledge the future that the present is building toward. It is the show's most fundamental formal decision, and it reflects the same impulse that drives every other act of comfortable forgetting the show has ever depicted. The preference for the version where things stay the same over the version where things have to be faced. The banned episodes exist in an interesting relationship to this impulse. They are the episodes where things had to be faced, where the comfortable version could not be maintained, where the world outside the floating timeline intruded in ways that the show could not float past. The September 11th removal was the real world's intrusion into the floating timeline's logic, the moment when the towers that existed permanently in the episode's eternal present tense had been destroyed in the real world, and the real world's destruction could not coexist with the episode's permanence. The Michael Jackson episode's removal was the real world's reckoning, with a specific person arriving in a way that made the collaboration impossible to maintain in its original form. The Homer's phobia fight was the real world's political and cultural climate, making certain kinds of honesty require extraordinary effort to achieve, rather than being the default. Each of these intrusions is an instance of the real world refusing to let the floating timeline float. Each of them required a decision about what to do when the world outside the eternal present tense of Springfield became incompatible with something Springfield contained. The decisions that were made remove the episode, fight for the episode, modify the content, pull it from syndication, were all attempts to manage the relationship between the floating timeline and the real world. To negotiate the terms on which the real world was allowed to change what Springfield was allowed to be, this negotiation is ongoing. It will not end as long as the show continues, because the show operates in an eternal present tense, and the real world keeps generating events that change what the eternal present tense contains and what it means. Every new cultural reckoning, every new tragedy, every new political moment, every new advance in what is understood about the harms that representation can cause, all of these are new intrusions of the real world into the floating timeline's logic, new negotiations about what Springfield is allowed to be in their wake. The banned episodes are the record of the negotiations that already happened. They are the evidence of all the times the real world reached into Springfield and changed something, or tried to, or succeeded, or was fought off. They are the proof that the floating timeline is not actually floating. It is tethered to the world, whether it likes it or not, and the tether pulls whenever the world pulls hard enough. The show has spent 35 years maintaining the illusion of permanence in a world that keeps changing. The banned episodes are the places where the maintenance failed, or was interrupted, or was judged insufficient. They are, in their way, the most honest parts of the show. The parts where the fiction of the eternal present tense was not sustainable and something had to give. Springfield is still there. The family is still on the couch. The loop still runs, but the loop is tethered. It has always been tethered, and the tether has always pulled. The banned episodes are where you can see the pulling, if you know where to look. Extended deep dive. The writer's room across time. What changes and what doesn't. To understand why the show's relationship to controversy has evolved across its history, you have to understand what changed in the writer's room as the show aged and as the cultural context around it shifted. The founding cohort of writers, the people who built the show in its first 3 to 5 seasons, operated with a specific set of assumptions about what the show was for and what it could do. These assumptions were formed partly by the educational backgrounds of the writers, partly by the specific moment in television history when the show began, and partly by the creative culture that formed around the show as it established itself as something genuinely new. The founding cohort believed, with some coherence, that the show's most important function was to be honest about the specific things it was looking at, honest about Homer's limitations and the love underneath them, honest about the specific texture of American working-class anxiety, honest about the specific ways that institutions fail the people they are supposed to serve. The comedy was the delivery mechanism for the honesty, not an end in itself. This meant that when the show wanted to do Homer's phobia, the question the writers were asking was, how do we do this honestly? How do we depict this subject in a way that is true to what the subject actually is, rather than in a way that is safe or comfortable or acceptable to the network? The fight with the network over the episode was a fight about the answer to this question. The network wanted an answer that was more comfortable, and the writers wanted an answer that was more honest, and the writers won because they had the leverage and the conviction. By the time the show was in season 25 or season 28 or season 32, the dynamics had changed significantly. The cohort that had built the show and fought these battles had mostly moved on. The show was being made by people who had grown up watching it, who understood it as an institution rather than as a project in progress, and whose relationship to the question of what the show was for was shaped by the show's established identity rather than by the founding ambition to create that identity. This is not a criticism. It is a description of what happens to all long-running creative enterprises. The people who build a thing from scratch are motivated by the building. The people who maintain a thing that already exists are motivated by the maintenance. The building and the maintenance are different projects, and they attract different sensibilities, and they produce different decisions when they encounter difficult choices. The founding cohort, confronted with the network's resistance to Homer's phobia, understood the resistance as something to fight because fighting for the episode was fighting for what the show was supposed to be. The maintenance cohort, confronted with the Apu controversy, understood the situation as something to manage because managing the controversy was what the show required at that moment in its institutional life. Both responses are coherent within the logic that produced them. The founding response is the logic of building. The maintenance response is the logic of preservation. And the difference between building and preserving is part of why the show's most significant content fights are concentrated in its earlier years. This is not the show failing to care about important subjects in its later years. The show has engaged with important subjects throughout its run. It is the show caring about important subjects in a way that is shaped by what the show has become over time, rather than in a way that is shaped by what the show was trying to become when it started. The difference is subtle but real, and it is visible in the archive if you look for it. The banned episodes of the early seasons are evidence of the show trying to be something. The modifications and managed responses of the later seasons are evidence of the show trying to remain something. Both are real forms of engagement with the world. Neither is dishonest, but they are not the same engagement, and they do not produce the same content. And understanding the difference between them is part of understanding the full history of what the show has been. Extended Deep Dive. What stays with you? A final meditation on Springfield and the things it keeps. There is a specific quality to the experience of thinking carefully about The Simpsons that is not common in thinking about television. Most television shows reward attention at the level of plot and character, but do not particularly reward the kind of sustained, patient attention that is prepared to look through the surface of the show at the deeper structures underneath it. The Simpsons rewards that attention specifically because those deeper structures are where the show's most interesting work is done. The patterns, the contradictions, the embedded arguments that the show makes without explicitly making them, the things that accumulate across hundreds of episodes into something that is larger and stranger than any individual piece of it. The banned episodes are part of that larger, stranger thing. They are the places where the deeper structures became visible because something happened to put pressure on them, where the show's relationship to power, or to grief, or to cultural representation, or to its own institutional context, was forced into the light by the specific circumstances of a specific episode at a specific moment. When you look at Stark Raving Dad in the context of its removal, You see the show's relationship to its own collaborative history and to the impossibility of keeping the creative work separate from the human beings who made it possible. When you look at the City of New York episode in the context of its years-long absence from syndication, you see the show's relationship to the real world that it exists alongside but tries, through the floating timeline and the eternal present, to keep at a distance. When you look at Homer's phobia in the context of the fight to make it, you see the show's relationship to its own ambition and to the institutional forces that ambition has to navigate. All of these things are part of what The Simpsons is. Not just the episodes that made it through clean, not just the couch gag and the Springfield skyline and the family dinner table and the nuclear power plant on the horizon, but also the fights and the removals and the modifications and the things that were almost said and weren't, and the things that were said and were then taken away. The show has been on the air for 35 years. In those 35 years, it has been fighting to say things, being prevented from saying things and having them removed, saying things and having them modified, and occasionally winning the fight and being able to say the thing it was trying to say without modification or removal. The history of that fight is worth knowing, not because it diminishes the show or exposes it as something less than what it presented itself as, but because it shows the show as something more, as a creative enterprise that was actually engaged with the world it was satirizing, that actually encountered resistance from the forces it was criticizing, that actually had to fight to maintain the honesty that it was most proud of in its best moments. The couch gag plays. The family runs across the living room. Everyone ends up on the couch. That is the show's promise. The family will be there, together, no matter what has happened in the episode. The banned episodes are the episodes where the promise had to be negotiated, where someone decided the family couldn't be in that configuration, or that episode, or in that form, where the couch was rearranged by forces outside the writer's room, and the episode that resulted was different from the episode that was being written. Some of those rearrangements were necessary, some were wrong, some were both. The history does not offer clean verdicts. What it offers is the story itself. 35 years of a show trying to say something true in a world that kept negotiating with what it was allowed to say. The negotiation never ended. It is still going. The show is still on the air. The world is still changing. The next band is probably already in production. Springfield will be here when you come back. The archive keeps everything. Extended deep dive. Hans Moleman, background death, and what the show does with its minor characters. Hans Moleman is 31 years old. This fact, delivered once in an early episode and never revisited, never explained, never integrated into any sustained narrative thread, sits in the show's archive as one of its strangest ambient details. Look at him. The ancient face, the Coke bottle glasses, the shuffling gait, the vulnerability to every physical catastrophe the show ever chose to assign to him. Now, hear the age again. 31. Something did that to him. Something took a person in the first years of adulthood and produced from that person the most thoroughly aged figure in a town full of people who appear not to age at all. Springfield's residents are frozen in their ages. The floating timeline preserves them. Nobody gets older, nobody gets younger, and the specific ages people were assigned in the show's first seasons remain their ages through all subsequent seasons. 35 years have passed and Bart is still 10. Except Hans Moleman. Moleman is 31, and Moleman looks like this. Which means that whatever the floating timeline is doing, whatever mechanism is keeping the rest of Springfield preserved, is not doing it for Moleman, or it is doing something different to him. Something that runs in the opposite direction. Not preservation, but acceleration. Not the pause that the rest of Springfield is stuck in, but a fast forward so extreme that a person's entire biological lifespan has been compressed into 3 decades. The show will never explain this. It puts the detail in front of you and moves on. Confident in the knowledge that the audience willing to notice the detail will find it funny and alarming in exactly equal measure, and that this is the right response to produce. But in the context of the radiation theory, the theory that the Springfield nuclear power plant's emissions have been doing something to the town's biology for decades, Moleman's 31 years become something specific and specific. They become the extreme case. The case where the mutation ran in the wrong direction, not producing the cartoon indestructibility that Homer displays, but producing the inverse, biological time running fast rather than stopped, The aging process accelerated rather than frozen. A man who at 31 has already lived what looks like a full human lifespan without ever having had the slow middle section where things are relatively normal and relatively good. Molman's deaths follow from this. He is biologically ancient in a body that is chronologically 31. The biology is fragile in the way that very old biology is fragile. The cartoon logic of the show allows him to die and return because the show's logic always allows for return. But the pattern of the deaths, the frequency, the variety, the casual repetition maps onto the pattern of a body that is perpetually at the edge of failing. He doesn't die dramatically. He dies the way very old people die, suddenly, from things that younger bodies would survive, from the cumulative weight of a biology that has no more reserve capacity. What makes Molman useful to the show is exactly this quality. He is the visible evidence of what the radiation is doing to Springfield in the most extreme form the show is willing to show. Homer's invulnerability is one extreme. Molman is the other, the same environmental cause, producing opposite biological effects, depending on whatever specific interaction between that cause and that individual biology produced the specific mutation. The show never connects these dots directly. It never puts the radiation theory in the mouths of the characters, never assigns it the status of fact within the narrative. But it puts all the dots in front of you, with the patient confidence that the audience paying attention will find them and connect them. Molman walking into traffic in the background of a scene, the traffic hitting him, the show moving on. The audience who noticed filing the death away alongside the other deaths, alongside the 31 years, alongside everything else, the show has been quietly accumulating in the background while Homer's adventures occupy the foreground. Springfield keeps its evidence in the margins, in the background. In the minor characters who don't have plots of their own but who, taken together, make an argument that the show is too smart to make explicitly, Molman shuffles forward. Something will hit him before the scene is over. He will be back in the next episode ready to be hit again. The eternal present tense holds for him too. In the end, the floating timeline keeps him at 31, even as it keeps him looking like this, even as it makes him die again and again and again. In Springfield, even mortality is a kind of loop. Extended deep dive, the Springfield Files, Aliens, and the episode that told the truth while pretending not to. Season 8, Episode 10. The 12th of January 1997. The episode that posed the question of alien life and answered it with the revelation that the thing Homer had been seeing in the woods near Springfield was Mr. Burns, glowing green from his weekly medical treatment. The joke lands in the specific way it was designed to land. As a comic deflation, the big question of extraterrestrial life resolved by the mundane fact of a billionaire's medical protocol. The alien is Burns. Burns is the alien. The mystery of the glowing figure in the woods is not a mystery about the cosmos. It is a mystery about what the power plant is doing to the man who owns it. But let's stay with the resolution for a moment, because the resolution is stranger and more disturbing than the joke usually lets itself be examined as. Burns undergoes a weekly medical treatment so intensive that it causes his body to emit visible light. The treatment keeps him alive for exactly one more week, at which point he needs another dose. Without it, he dies. This is presented as the explanation for the alleged alien sighting, and the explanation is accepted by the episode and by the audience as sufficient to close the question. But consider what the explanation actually contains. The richest man in Springfield, the man who owns the primary source of the town's electrical power, is dependent for his survival on a weekly medical intervention that involves enough radiation exposure to make his body glow. He undergoes this intervention so routinely and so regularly that he has a specific schedule for it, specific staff who administer it, specific routes he walks home from it through the woods outside Springfield. He is so saturated with radiation on a weekly basis that he is visibly distinguishable from other living things by the light his body emits. The dazed, euphoric state he is in after each treatment is the state of someone who has just absorbed a significant dose of something that his body has been calibrated to require and to process. The euphoria is the sensation of a body receiving what it needs to survive for another week. And the people of Springfield, encountering this glowing figure in the woods, conclude that it must be an extraterrestrial, not a heavily irradiated person. Not someone undergoing medical treatment that involves controlled radiation exposure. An alien from outer space? The category that would require the intervention of federal law enforcement and would constitute a discovery that changed the understanding of the universe was, to Springfield, the more immediately available explanation for a man who glowed in the dark. The denial required to produce this conclusion is the subject of the episode, and the episode spends considerable time establishing it. The town's response to the possible alien is frenzied, credulous, and completely divorced from the more obvious explanation that would require them to look at the power plant. The FBI agents, Mulder and Scully, arrive and investigate with the same fervid willingness to believe in extraterrestrials that the town has demonstrated, and the investigation produces the same conclusion that the town's initial response had produced. Until the reveal, until Burns. Until the mundane, specific, entirely non-alien explanation for the glowing figure. The reveal is funny. It is also, if you are paying attention, deeply horrifying. The horror is in the specific nature of what Burns is, and what he requires, and what that requirement implies about what the power plant has been doing to the town around him. Burns requires weekly radiation treatment to survive, because his biology has been so thoroughly altered by his proximity to nuclear material over so many decades that it can no longer function without external radiation input. He is, in the most literal sense, a creature of the power plant. The radiation that his plant leaks into Springfield's environment is the radiation that keeps him alive, administered in a controlled form rather than the ambient form that the plant delivers to everyone else. The episode tells you this and then proceeds as if it has told you nothing significant. The reveal resolves the comedy. The town goes back to normal. Springfield resets, and no one pauses to think about what it means that the man who owns their power plant literally requires radiation to survive and literally glows green after receiving it. This is the show doing what it does with its most significant information, putting it in front of you clearly in the form of a joke, and then trusting that the audience willing to look at it will see it, and the audience not willing to look at it will simply remember the joke. The Springfield Files was broadcast in most markets without significant controversy or modification. It is not one of the banned episodes in any formal sense, but it belongs to the larger story of what the show was saying and what the show's audience was being offered the opportunity to hear, because it is one of the clearest and most explicit moments in the entire show's history, where the radiation theory is not a theory, but simply a fact being presented in a comedic frame. Burns glows. Burns requires radiation to live. Burns's plant is the primary source of radiation in Springfield. The connection is not hidden. It is right there, in the resolution of the alien joke, waiting to be seen by anyone who keeps looking after the laugh has passed. The episode was not banned. The information it contained was not suppressed. It was presented clearly in a show watched by millions of people, and the people who were watching mostly took the joke and let the information go. Springfield kept the secret, the only way Springfield has ever kept its secrets, by telling them in plain sight, where anyone can see them, and trusting that the comfortable version of things will prevent most people from looking. Extended deep dive. The Simpsons movie, The Dome, and the episode that became a feature film. There is a sense in which the most significant banned Simpsons content is not any specific episode but the movie that the show produced in 2007, The Simpsons movie. The film is not banned anywhere that I know of. It was a significant commercial success, made over $500 million at the global box office, and was received as a successful expansion of the show's format to the feature film length. But the movie is relevant to the banned episode story because of what it chose to do with the show's most persistent, unresolved thread, the environmental contamination of Springfield. In the movie, the contamination reaches a breaking point. Springfield's lake, which had been the subject of environmental jokes throughout the show's run, the body of water into which the power plant had been leaking radioactive material for decades, becomes so toxic that the EPA determines the entire town must be contained. A giant glass dome is placed over Springfield to prevent the contamination from spreading to the rest of the country. The town is declared an environmental hazard zone. This is the most direct confirmation the show has ever produced of the radiation theory. The Environmental Protection Agency, presented as a functioning real institution within the show's universe, looks at Springfield and concludes that it is a toxic zone. The dome is the dome. The containment is literal. Springfield is what it has always been, and for one theatrical release, the show was willing to say it out loud. The movie was released, celebrated, and then largely set aside as the show continued in its television form. The events of the movie were not integrated into the ongoing continuity of the series in any significant way. The dome was raised. The dome was removed. Springfield went back to being Springfield. The reset operated at the level of the film, not just at the level of the episode. This is the floating timeline operating at its largest scale. Not just an episode resetting, not just a season passing without acknowledging the previous one, but a theatrical feature film's events being essentially discarded so that the eternal present tense of the television show could continue as before. The dome is not a banned episode, but the dome is the show saying, in the most public and commercially visible format it has ever used, the thing that the banned episodes were trying to say, that Springfield is contaminated, that the contamination is real, that the people in it are living inside an environmental disaster that their cognitive damage has prevented them from fully perceiving. The show said this in a movie that $500 million worth of ticket sales confirms was seen by an enormous number of people. And then the show put the dome away and pretended it hadn't happened. This is Springfield. This is always Springfield. The town that contains the truth and expels the truth and goes on as before. The town that knows and forgets and knows again and forgets again. The dome is in the archive. The dome was real, within the show's universe, for one film's running time. And then the show needed to be the show again. And the dome went away. And the eternal present tense reasserted itself. And Homer went back to the plant on Monday morning. The dome is not a banned episode, but it is the thing that all the banned episodes were gesturing toward. The acknowledgement that the thing the show has been building toward for 35 years is not a joke about a nuclear power plant. It is a story about a town that has been poisoned, that cannot see what has been done to it, and that keeps choosing the comfortable version of things over the version that would require it to act. Springfield is still there. The dome came down. The water is still the same. Homer is still in Sector 7G. And the person who could fix all of it is still the most powerful man in town, still alive past any biological explanation, still glowing green after his weekly treatments, still looking out at the town he has broken and finding it exactly the way he needs it to be. The loop holds. The family is on the couch. The theme music plays. Springfield keeps its secrets by telling them where everyone can see them and trusting that everyone will look away. Tonight, we looked. Thank you for spending this time in Springfield with me. Drop a comment below with where you're watching from and what time it is wherever you are. Subscribe if you haven't, there's more to come, and you should be here for it. Springfield will be here when you come back. It always is. A note on what we didn't cover. The episodes that belong here, but aren't here. Any treatment of the banned Simpsons episodes is going to be incomplete. The show has been running for 35 seasons and has generated content controversies in dozens of markets across dozens of decades, and the documentation of those controversies is scattered across television archives, academic papers, fan sites, DVD commentaries, journalistic coverage from various countries in various languages, and the institutional memories of people who worked in international television distribution in the 1990s and 2000s. There are episodes that belong in this discussion that are not in this discussion. Specific Treehouse of Horror segments that were modified in specific international markets in specific years. Specific lines from specific episodes that were dubbed differently in specific countries without any public acknowledgement. Specific storylines that were edited for specific regions in ways that changed the meaning of the episodes they appeared in. The full inventory of what was done to The Simpsons in its international distribution is not available in any single place, and assembling it would require access to production records and distribution contracts that are not publicly available. What is available is what we've gone through tonight. The cases that were documented because they were loud enough to generate press coverage or significant enough to generate retrospective accounts from the people involved. The Stark Raving Dad removal, because the production company announced it publicly. The New York episode's post-September 11th absence, because it was widely noticed. The Homer's phobia fight, because the people who fought it had reasons to talk about it afterward. The Brazil diplomatic incident, because the Brazilian government made it public. The Apu situation, because a documentary made it public. These are the visible cases. The invisible cases, the routine modifications, the quiet edits, the localization decisions that changed what specific audiences received without anyone announcing what had been changed are the majority of what happened to the show's content in its global distribution, and they are largely unrecoverable from outside the institutions that made them. What we have is the surface. The surface is interesting, and it is worth understanding, and it points toward the larger phenomenon that it is the visible part of. But it is worth being honest that what we have been examining tonight is the part of the story that managed to become visible, which is not the same as the whole story. The whole story is somewhere in the archives of the show's distributors and of the broadcasting authorities of 60 countries, in the notes sessions and the production documents and the distribution contracts and the formal regulatory decisions that shaped what the world's audiences received when they turned on The Simpsons. Most of that story will not be told in any accessible form. It will stay in the archives, which are institutional rather than public, and the institutional archives keep their secrets more effectively than Springfield does, which means that everything we've discussed tonight is the beginning of the story, not the end of it. The beginning is what's available. The rest is still in the boxes. Homer is still driving home. The plant is still there. The water is still what it is. Springfield is still keeping its secrets in the margins where anyone willing to look can find them. And somewhere in those margins, in the spaces between what was said and what was allowed to be said, the show that wanted to be made is still there, waiting for whoever goes looking. Afterward, why these stories are worth telling at this hour. We've been in this long enough that the night has gotten quieter, and the earlier sections have probably started to blend together the way things blend together when the hour is late and the material is rich. So, let me say clearly, in the plainest terms I can find, what the point of all of it was. The Simpsons is not just a television show. It has been running since before most of its current audience was born, and in its running it has produced a record of American life and American culture and American failure that is larger and stranger and more honest than almost any other document of its kind. That record includes not just the episodes that aired, but the episodes that were almost made and weren't, the episodes that were made and then removed, the episodes that were modified before they could say what they were trying to say, and the episodes that somehow got through clean and said exactly what they meant. All of those categories are part of the record. All of them tell you something that the others don't. The episodes that got through clean tell you about the show's creative ambitions at their most fully realized. The episodes that were modified tell you about the pressure those ambitions operated under. The episodes that were removed tell you about the limits of what the world was prepared to accommodate at specific moments in specific circumstances. The episodes that were almost made and weren't tell you about the vast, mostly invisible territory of what the show was trying to be that the show was never fully allowed to be. Understanding all of this together gives you a picture of the show that is more complete and more honest than understanding any one part of it in isolation. The couch gag is not the whole show. The Emmy wins are not the whole show. The bands and the fights and the diplomatic incidents and the modifications are not the whole show. All of it together is the show. The ambition and the institution, the creative vision and the commercial reality, the honesty that got through and the honesty that was redirected, the things that were said and the things that were prevented from being said. That whole picture is worth having. It is worth the time it takes to assemble. The night is quiet. The screen is still on. Springfield is still there. In whatever form the hour finds it, the streamed version, the syndicated version, the officially available version with its gaps and its modifications and its long history of negotiated truths and institutional compromises. The full version, the version that includes everything, the aired and the banned and the modified and the fought over lives in the archive and in the memories of the people who were there for all of it, and in the spaces between what was said and what was trying to be said. That is the Springfield worth knowing, the one that includes everything. That is the one we visited tonight.